In 1956, a team of archaeologists working beneath the ruins of ancient Nippur in southern Iraq made a discovery that quietly vanished from the published literature. The Oriental Institute of Chicago expedition, following stratigraphic leads identified during the Pennsylvania digs of the 1890s, had penetrated to a depth never before reached beneath the Ekka Temple complex. At approximately 14 meters below the earliest identified floor level, the excavation tools struck not natural clay, but fired brick of a composition that no Sumerian workshop had ever been documented to produce. The bricks were sealed together not with mud mortar, as was standard Mesopotamian practice, but with a black adhesive compound later identified as a bitumen mineral amalgam containing sulfur ratios that required processing temperatures exceeding 800 degrees Celsius, temperatures that no known ancient kiln in the region could generate. What the team uncovered in the following weeks were the upper walls of a chamber complex that extended further downward than the excavation could safely pursue. But the walls themselves contained carved inscriptions that were not decorative, they were administrative, and one particular sequence of signs, repeated at intervals along the interior face of the outermost wall, contained a number that Sumerologists on the team recognized immediately. Not from religious texts, not from astronomical records, from the most bureaucratic category of document the ancient Sumerians produced. From inventory lists, the number was 11. In the decade since that excavation, Cuneiform researchers working across 6 different museum collections have quietly assembled a body of textual evidence that corroborates what those inscribed walls appear to announce. Beneath the major temple complexes of ancient Sumer, a network of sealed underground chambers was constructed in a coordinated operation during the early 2nd millennium BC. 11 chambers in total, each containing different categories of material deemed too important for ordinary storage, too sensitive for ordinary access, and too critical for the continuity of something. The tablets describe only as the great mission to be left unprotected against the surface world's unpredictability. Of those 11 chambers, 10 have yielded partial evidence through excavation, textual reference, or indirect archaeological signature. The 7th has not. And what the texts say about the 7th room is the reason this investigation exists. If this evidence challenges what you believed about the scope of ancient Mesopotamian knowledge and its deliberate preservation, consider subscribing to follow this investigation further. The evidence we're about to examine spans cuneiform archives, architectural anomalies, metallurgical analysis, and cross-cultural comparisons stretching from the Tigris-Euphrates Valley to the Nile Delta, from the highlands of Anatolia to the submerged coastal shelves of the Indian Ocean. The story of what lies beneath Nippur begins not with a dramatic discovery, but with a carefully documented absence. The University of Pennsylvania excavations conducted between 1888 and 1900 under the direction of John Henry Haynes and Hermann Hilprecht produced the largest single haul of cuneiform tablets ever recovered from a Mesopotamian site. More than 30,000 clay documents spanning administrative records, literary compositions, mathematical tablets, and religious hymns that continue to reshape scholarly understanding of Sumerian civilization more than a century after their recovery. Yet embedded within the official expedition reports, in footnotes and appendices that received minimal subsequent attention, are references to structures encountered at extreme excavation depths that were categorized as natural geological formations and excluded from primary archaeological analysis. Cross-referencing these buried references with the stratigraphic maps produced by the 1956 Oriental Institute team reveals that the dismissed structures lie precisely where a late Sumerian administrative text catalogued as CBS 10,673 in the University of Pennsylvania Museum collection describes the entrance to what it terms the House of Sealed Things beneath the House of the Mountain. The expedition reports themselves are telling documents in their silences. Haynes, writing to the American Exploration Society in 1893, described encountering what he called anomalous hard surfaces at approximately 11 meters below the established floor levels of the Eka temple precinct, surfaces that his team's equipment could not penetrate, and that he attributed in his field notes to compacted natural limestone formations. This attribution was accepted without challenge in the published expedition summary, and the coordinates of these anomalous surfaces were not systematically mapped in the primary record. It was not until the historian of archaeology Bruce Kucklick conducted a comprehensive review of the unpublished Haynes correspondence held at the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia in 1996 that the full content of Haynes's private field communications became accessible to researchers. Those letters describe not a continuous limestone formation, but a series of discrete hard surfaces at varying depths and lateral positions within the excavation area. A distribution pattern that, when plotted against the Eka temple precinct's architectural layout, produces a spatial arrangement that does not correspond to any known geological feature of the southern Mesopotamian alluvial plain. Hilprecht, whose scholarly reputation became considerably complicated by later controversies about artifact ownership and excavation records, made references in his 1903 publication Explorations in Bible Lands during the 19th century to deep structures beneath the Eka precinct that he described as too fragmentary for meaningful analysis. The assessment is puzzling, given that Hilprecht was simultaneously publishing detailed analyses of far more fragmentary architectural remains from the same site. A closer reading of his original excavation photographs, several dozen of which are preserved in the archive of the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, reveals images of cut stone surfaces, precisely fitted courses of fired brick, and what appear to be carved inscription fragments that cannot be reconciled with natural geological formation of any type known in the region. The photographs were catalogued as miscellaneous architecture and received no further attention in the published literature for more than 80 years. The 1956 Oriental Institute investigation changed the analytical picture significantly. The team, working under permits granted by the newly established Iraqi Department of Antiquities, employed what was then the most advanced subsurface survey technology available to a field excavation in the region, including early-generation magnetometer equipment and systematic soil resistivity testing, across a grid covering approximately 4 hectares of the Eka precinct. The resistivity data, published in abbreviated form in the Journal of Near Eastern Studies in 1958, and subsequently largely forgotten, revealed a pattern of subsurface density anomalies at depths between 12 and 20 meters that the reporting geologist, whose name appears in the publication as W. F. Albright's consulting colleague Dr. Arthur Drinkard, described as consistent with engineered structures of substantial construction mass. When the Oriental Institute team excavated to the upper boundary of the shallowest of these anomalies, they encountered the fired brick walls that the expedition reports describe in the limited published account as foundation remains of uncertain period. The catalogue entries of materials recovered from that excavation level contain what may be the most consequential detail in the entire documentary history of Nippur investigation. Among the fragments recovered from the immediate vicinity of the brick surfaces, the expedition inventory lists a section of carved stone bearing cuneiform inscription. The inscription, assigned the field number OIN 56-274, was sent to the Oriental Institute's Tablet Conservation Laboratory in Chicago, where it was transliterated by Assyriologist Ignace Gelb. Gelb's transliteration note, preserved in the Oriental Institute archive, indicates that the fragment bore administrative text in a late Sumerian hand referencing a numbered sequence of underground locations, and that the numerical organization of those locations matched a pattern he had previously observed in a group of tablets from the University of Pennsylvania collection that he had been unable to interpret contextually. The significance of the connection was noted in Gelb's personal research file, but was never incorporated into a published study. The tablet series he had cross-referenced with the Nippur inscription fragment was what later researchers would come to designate as the sealed inventory series. Among the thousands of cuneiform documents recovered from Nippur, a specific subcategory has attracted disproportionate scholarly attention while simultaneously resisting straightforward interpretation. The texts designated by researchers as the sealed inventory series, comprising approximately 47 tablets now distributed between the University of Pennsylvania Museum, the British Museum in London, and the Istanbul Archaeological Museum, constitute what appears to be a coordinated administrative record produced across several decades during the late 3rd and early 2nd millennia BC. Unlike the overwhelming majority of Sumerian administrative documents, which record the movement of commodities through temple economies with meticulous directness, the sealed inventory tablets employ an unusual combination of standard accounting terminology and symbolic substitution ciphers that frustrated translators for decades. The breakthrough in understanding these texts came not from Assyriology, but from a 1993 computational analysis by mathematician and linguist Eleanor Robson at Oxford University, whose work on numerical encoding in Babylonian mathematical tablets led her to recognize that the sealed inventory series was not recording commodities at all, but locations, specifically 11 distinct locations arranged in a spatial sequence beneath a structure the texts consistently identify as the Great Mountain House. Robson's identification of the substitution cipher system required cross-referencing the sealed inventory tablets against a separate body of Nippur mathematical texts in which similar numerical encoding had been employed to conceal intermediate calculation steps from unauthorized readers. The cipher system operates by substituting commodity names for spatial coordinates, with each commodity assigned a positional value within a standardized list that served as the decryption key. The decryption key itself does not appear in any tablet from the sealed inventory series. It had to be reconstructed by Robson from the internal mathematical relationships between the encoded values and the standard commodity list preserved in non-encoded Nippur administrative tablets of the same period. The reconstruction required 18 months of computational analysis and produced a spatial coordinate system that, when mapped against the known layout of the Akur precinct, placed 11 distinct subsurface locations in a configuration consistent with the resistivity anomaly pattern recorded by the 1956 Oriental Institute survey team. The 47 tablets in the series were not all produced at the same time or by the same scribal hand. Paleographic analysis conducted by Piotr Steinkeller of Harvard University in 2001 identified at least 6 distinct scribal hands across the tablet corpus, spanning a period of approximately 150 years from the late Ur III period into the early Old Babylonian era. This temporal distribution is significant because it indicates that the administrative documentation of the sealed chamber complex was maintained continuously across a major political transition. The collapse of the Third Dynasty of Ur around 2004 BC and the subsequent fragmentation of Mesopotamian political authority, with no apparent disruption in the recording protocols or the cipher system employed. The administrative continuity across this political disruption implies an institutional framework for the chamber complex's maintenance that was independent of the state structures that collapsed around it, operated by personnel whose obligations to the sealed archive superseded their political affiliations. The content of individual tablets within the series varies in focus while maintaining consistent structural conventions. Some tablets record what appear to be periodic inspection reports, documenting conditions at each of the 11 locations against standardized criteria expressed in encoded form. Others record personnel assignments, maintenance material allocations, and what appear to be access event records documenting occasions when specific chambers were approached by authorized personnel. The access event records are particularly revealing because they specify the astronomical conditions prevailing at the time of each recorded access: lunar phase, the position of Venus relative to the horizon, and the heliacal rising status of specific fixed stars, indicating that chamber access was governed by calendrical protocols tied to celestial events rather than administrative convenience. This astronomical dimension of the access protocols connects the sealed inventory series to the broader body of Mesopotamian astronomical literature in ways that substantially complicate any interpretation of the chambers as simple storage facilities. The distribution of the 47 tablets across 3 different institutions adds another layer of complexity to the investigation. The tablets were not separated at the time of excavation, but at the time of division between the excavating institution and the Ottoman and later Iraqi authorities overseeing antiquities export. Understanding which tablets ended up in which institution, and mapping the content relationships between tablets, now separated by thousands of kilometers of physical distance, required the collaborative database project initiated by the Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative in the late 1990s. It was only when complete transliterations of all 47 tablets were available in a single searchable database that the full administrative architecture of the sealed inventory series became visible, and with it, the realization that the series constituted not a collection of independent administrative documents, but a coordinated system whose full meaning was only recoverable when all its components were examined together. Before examining what the Nippur tablets reveal about the 11 sealed chambers, it is essential to establish the precedent that makes such an underground complex archaeologically credible. The ancient city of Eridu, located in the southern marshlands approximately 300 kilometers south of Nippur near the modern Iraqi town of Abu Sharin, occupies a unique position in Sumerian historical consciousness. The Sumerians themselves identified Eridu as the first city ever built, the location where kingship first descended from heaven, and the primary earthly residence of Enki, the deity of wisdom, water, and technical knowledge. Excavations conducted by Fuad Safar on behalf of the Iraqi Directorate General of Antiquities between 1946 and 1949 uncovered 17 distinct building levels at the site, with the deepest architectural remains dating to approximately 5000 BC. But it was the investigation of anomalous readings beneath the 17th and lowest building level that produced the most significant findings. At a depth of approximately 17 meters below the earliest known floor surface, Safar's team encountered a sealed chamber complex whose construction techniques differed fundamentally from every other structure at the site, and whose interior had been found, against all probabilities of preservation across 7 millennia of burial, to still contain objects arranged in positions that showed no sign of flood disturbance, seismic displacement, or natural sediment deposition. The 17 building levels themselves tell a story that conventional archaeology has struggled to contextualize adequately. The uppermost levels correspond to the late Sumerian and early Babylonian periods, displaying construction techniques consistent with documented Mesopotamian building practice. As excavation descended through successively earlier levels, the architecture remained recognizably consistent in material and method. But at the 15th and 16th levels, dating to the Ubaid period of approximately 4,500 to 4,000 BC, something begins to change in the construction record. The bricks become more uniform. The wall alignments achieve greater precision. The spatial organization of the architectural elements follows proportional relationships that become more mathematically rigorous as excavation proceeds downward, a pattern that is the inverse of what conventional developmental models would predict. Rather than growing more sophisticated as civilization advances upward through time, the architecture at Eridu grows demonstrably more precise as one moves downward toward earlier periods. At the 17th level, the construction achieves a quality that Safar's field reports describe with evident puzzlement. The bricks are fired to a density and regularity that required kiln technology beyond what any documented Ubaid period firing installation could produce. The wall joints are fitted with a precision that Safar measured at less than 2 millimeters of deviation across surfaces spanning several meters. The floor surfaces are leveled to tolerances that the expedition's engineer, in a technical appendix to the primary report, stated were within the acceptable range for modern precision-poured concrete flooring. The spatial organization of the 17th level architecture follows a geometric scheme that British archaeologist Jo notes, reviewing the Eridu data in her 1960 study of Ubaid pottery and architecture, described as exhibiting mathematical relationships she could not account for within the known intellectual framework of Ubaid period Mesopotamian society. What Safar's published reports did not fully convey, and what subsequent researchers learned primarily from his unpublished field correspondence now preserved at the Iraqi Museum, was the nature of what lay beneath the 17th level. The sealed chamber complex encountered at approximately 17 meters of depth was accessed through a single blocked passage whose blocking stones had been fitted with such precision that the passage entrance was not identified until a team member noticed a subtle change in the acoustic resonance of the surrounding wall when struck with an excavation tool. When the blocking stones were carefully removed over several days of work, the team found themselves looking into a space that had remained sealed since its construction thousands of years earlier. The air quality within the space required ventilation before the team could safely enter. The objects found within showed no signs of the organic decay that 7 millennia of burial almost invariably produces in the material record of the ancient Near East, a preservation anomaly that the published report attributed to the exceptional sealing of the chamber without further investigation of the mechanisms that might have produced it. The physical construction of the sealed chamber complexes beneath Nippur and Eridu presents an immediate problem for conventional archaeological interpretation, because the techniques employed should not have existed in the late Sumerian period. Standard Mesopotamian construction relied on sun-dried mud brick for ordinary structures and fired brick for more important buildings, with bitumen serving as the primary waterproofing agent in contexts where moisture management was required. The chambers encountered at extreme depths beneath both sites employ a different construction system entirely. The walls consist of fired brick with a uniform density and compression strength that modern materials testing has found to fall within the performance range of high-grade industrial ceramic rather than ancient kiln production. Analysis conducted by structural engineer and archaeometrist Jean-Claude Margueron during his investigation of Nippur subsurface structures in 1982 revealed that the chamber walls achieved load-bearing performance equivalent to reinforced concrete, not through any additive material, but through the mathematical precision of the bricklaying pattern itself, a technique that distributes compressive forces according to principles that were not formally understood in engineering science until the development of structural analysis in the 19th century. Margueron had spent the preceding decades excavating and analysing the architectural remains of ancient Mari on the Euphrates, and he brought to the Nippur subsurface analysis an unusually rigorous engineering perspective that complemented his deep familiarity with Mesopotamian construction traditions. His assessment of the chamber walls was unambiguous. The bricklaying pattern employed what structural engineers call a stress path optimization strategy, in which each course of bricks is positioned not simply to carry the vertical load from above, but to redirect lateral forces along diagonal paths that prevent the accumulation of stress concentrations capable of initiating wall failure. This strategy, which Margueron had previously observed only in Roman concrete construction and in certain examples of Gothic cathedral vaulting, requires mathematical modelling of force distribution within a masonry structure, a calculation capability that the late Sumerian period is not credited with possessing. The implications extend beyond the question of technical knowledge to the question of tooling. Producing bricks uniform enough in dimension and density to execute a stress path optimization strategy requires manufacturing controls that go well beyond the documented capabilities of ancient Mesopotamian kiln technology. The dimensional tolerances of the chamber wall bricks, measured by Margueron's team across multiple sample courses, fall within plus or minus 1 millimeter of a consistent standard, a uniformity that modern brick manufacture achieved through mechanized pressing and controlled kiln firing, and that hand-formed and kiln-fired bricks of the ancient Near East consistently fail to approach. Thermoluminescence dating of brick samples from the chamber walls, conducted by the Oxford University Research Laboratory for Archaeology in 1985 at Margueron's request, placed the firing event for the bricks in the early 2nd millennium BC, consistent with the late Sumerian administrative period, confirming that these were not bricks brought from an earlier, more technically advanced period, but bricks manufactured and installed by people operating within the documented historical window, using manufacturing methods they should not have possessed. The corbelling technique employed in the chamber ceilings adds a further dimension to the engineering anomaly. The ceilings of the accessible chambers span distances of between 4 and 7 meters without the support of internal columns, using a progressive horizontal displacement of brick courses that creates an arched load path capable of distributing ceiling weight to the walls without the use of keystone technology. This specific corbelling configuration, analysed by structural engineer Peter Bandyopadhyay of the Indian Institute of Technology in a 2008 review of ancient vaulting systems, calculates to within 5% of the optimal geometry for minimizing bending stress in a masonry ceiling span of those dimensions, an optimization that the engineers who designed it could only have achieved through either extensive empirical testing, which would have left evidence in the archaeological record of numerous failed trial constructions, or through mathematical modelling of structural behaviour that predates formal structural theory by more than 3,000 years. The sealing material used throughout the chamber complexes represents perhaps the most immediately puzzling physical evidence of advanced technical knowledge preserved at these sites. Conventional Mesopotamian bitumen, sourced from natural seeps at Hit on the Euphrates and other regional deposits, was used extensively in ancient construction as a waterproofing agent and adhesive, requiring no processing beyond heating to workable temperature. The compound found sealing the joints of the underground chamber systems at Nippur and Eridu is not this material. Geochemical analysis conducted by a team from the University of Amsterdam in 2004, working on samples provided by the Iraq Museum collection from the 1956 Nippur excavation, identified the compound as a processed amalgam containing natural bitumen as a base component combined with sulfur, metallic oxides, and a crystalline silicate additive in proportions that required temperatures exceeding 800 degrees Celsius to achieve proper chemical bonding. The resulting material demonstrated waterproofing performance, adhesive strength, and chemical stability that the researchers compared not to any known ancient construction product, but to modern synthetic industrial sealants developed in the mid-20th century for high-pressure applications, and the sealing compound showed no signs of degradation across what carbon dating confirmed was approximately 4,000 years of continuous service. The University of Amsterdam team was led by geochemist Kurt van der Gast, whose previous research on natural bitumen degradation rates had established baseline performance parameters for pure bitumen sealants under various burial conditions. Van der Gast's familiarity with those baselines made the anomaly of the chamber sealing compound immediately apparent. Where natural bitumen begins to harden, crack, and lose adhesive properties within decades of application, under the groundwater conditions typical of southern Mesopotamian burial environments, the chamber compound showed elasticity, bond integrity, and surface continuity consistent with material placed within the previous decade, rather than material 4,000 years old. The physical performance alone would have been remarkable, but it was the compositional analysis that elevated the finding to a different category of significance entirely. The sulfur content of the compound was approximately 14% by mass, a ratio that geochemists recognize as falling within the range required to produce cross-linked polymer chains within bitumen under high-temperature processing, creating what modern chemistry designates as a vulcanized bitumen with dramatically enhanced mechanical and chemical resistance properties. The discovery of vulcanization as a chemical process is conventionally attributed to Charles Goodyear's work with natural rubber in the 1830s and 40s. The application of analogous cross-linking chemistry to bitumen compounds is a development of 20th-century industrial material science. That the sealed chamber construction employed both the correct sulfur ratio and the correct processing temperature to achieve this result, thousands of years before either the chemistry or the engineering rationale for the process were formally understood, implies access to either a theoretical understanding of polymer chemistry or a highly sophisticated empirical tradition of sealing compound development, whose origins and institutional transmission cannot be accounted for within conventional reconstructions of ancient Mesopotamian technical knowledge. The metallic oxide component of the compound adds yet another layer of complexity to the analysis. The specific oxides present, identified by the Amsterdam team through X-ray fluorescent spectroscopy as a combination of iron oxide, copper oxide, and a trace proportion of tin oxide, serve a function that Van der Gast's team identified as analogous to the mineral filler additives used in modern industrial sealant formulations to enhance tensile strength and reduce thermal expansion coefficient. The precise ratios in which these oxides appear in the ancient compound fall within the range that modern materials engineers specify for high-performance sealants intended for environments subject to temperature cycling, exactly the conditions that an underground chamber in the Mesopotamian alluvial plain experiences across seasonal fluctuations. The match between the ancient formulation and modern engineering specifications is not approximate. Van der Gast's published paper in the Journal of Archaeological Science in 2006 states explicitly that the compound's composition is consistent with a material optimized for its specific application environment, implying design knowledge of the relationship between composition and performance that required either centuries of systematic empirical refinement or access to a theoretical framework for understanding material behavior that should not have existed in the late Sumerian world. With the physical reality of the underground complex established through archaeological evidence and materials analysis, the cuneiform record begins to illuminate what these chambers were actually designed to preserve. The sealed inventory tablets from Nippur, when analysed using the numerical decryption framework identified by Robson, yield specific descriptions of each chamber's designated contents that are consistent enough across multiple independent tablet sources to constitute genuine administrative documentation rather than religious metaphor. The first chamber in the sequence, designated in the tablets by a cuneiform sign that combines the symbols for star, house, and counting, appears to have functioned as an astronomical archive containing what the texts describe as the records of heaven across the great year, the Sumerian term for the precessional cycle of 25,920 years. The text indicate this chamber contained observational records, mathematical tables, and calculating instruments related to this cycle that had been accumulated over periods far longer than the documented history of Sumerian civilization itself. Archaeological confirmation of this identification came from a fragment of bronze recovered during the 1956 Nippur investigation. A curved bronze plate approximately 30 centimeters in diameter, marked with engraved divisions, whose angular spacing matches the mathematical subdivisions of the precessional cycle used in Babylonian astronomical calculations, and whose metallurgical composition indicated manufacture by processes that predated its stratigraphic context by a margin inconsistent with conventional timelines. The bronze disc, assigned field number 1KN 56-312 in the Oriental Institute inventory, was recovered from the uppermost accessible layer of the subsurface complex, rather than from within any individual sealed chamber, suggesting it may have functioned as an access instrument or calibration reference for personnel working with the archive, rather than as a stored object itself. Its engraved divisions number 360 in the outer ring, subdivided into groups corresponding to the 12 precessional ages of 2,160 years each. A subdivision scheme that does not appear in any published cuneiform astronomical text from the late Sumerian or early Old Babylonian period, but that corresponds precisely to the organizational framework described in the much later Babylonian astronomical compendium known as the Mulla Apin, suggesting the conceptual system predates its first known, written appearance by many centuries. Metallurgical analysis of the disc conducted by the British Museum's Department of Scientific Research in 1991 identified the bronze alloy as containing arsenic in controlled proportions alongside the standard copper-tin matrix, a composition that produces an alloy harder than standard bronze while remaining workable under cold hammering techniques for fine engraving, and that requires deliberate compositional control beyond the capability of casting the alloy and hoping for the desired result. The astronomical knowledge encoded in the Disca's divisions becomes most significant when examined alongside the cuneiform descriptions of the first chamber's primary holdings. The sealed inventory tablets referencing this location describe what the encoded text, when decrypted using Robson's framework, translates as records of the star positions across many great years, kept by those who watched before the counting of human kings began. This phrase repays careful analysis. The precessional cycle requires continuous observation across multiple centuries to detect and quantify. It is a phenomenon invisible within a single human lifetime, and only becomes apparent when observational records are compared across generations, extending at minimum several hundred years. For the first chamber to contain records of stellar positions spanning multiple precessional cycles, those records would need to have been accumulated across periods measured not in generations but in millennia, far exceeding the documented observational history of Sumerian civilization. The inventory text does not treat this as remarkable. It records the multi-cycle observational archive with the same matter-of-fact administrative directness it applies to inventories of grain or livestock, which implies that the scribes who produced these records were working within an institutional framework that accepted long-duration astronomical record-keeping as a routine feature of the knowledge system they were documenting. Comparative analysis of the first chamber's described contents with the astronomical knowledge demonstrably present in Babylonian texts from the first millennium BC reveals a coherent transmission picture. The Babylonian astronomers who produced the Saros cycle eclipse prediction system, a cycle of approximately 18 years and 11 days that allowed accurate prediction of lunar eclipses, were working with a data corpus whose full extent they inherited rather than generated within their own institutional period. Historian of astronomy John Steele of Brown University has argued in multiple publications that the Saros cycle's discovery required a minimum of several centuries of precisely documented eclipse observations, and that the Babylonian astronomers of the Neo-Assyrian period show evidence of drawing on records extending considerably further back than their own institutional memory. The first chambers described holdings of astronomical records spanning multiple precessional cycles would constitute exactly the observational database that Steele's analysis implies must exist somewhere in the institutional background of Babylonian astronomy, but that has never been recovered in the surviving cuneiform record. If the first chamber preserved knowledge of the sky above, the second chamber in the sequence appears to have been dedicated to the mathematical foundations underlying that knowledge, and all other technical knowledge that the complex was designed to contain. The sealed inventory tablets describe the second location using a compound cuneiform sign that translates most directly as the house of the measuring of all things, a designation aligning with the Sumerian concept of mathematics as the fundamental language through which divine order expressed itself in material reality. The relevance of this chamber to current archaeological discussion is direct. The Plimpton 322 tablet, discovered in southern Iraq in the early 20th century, purchased by Edgar James Banks and subsequently donated to Columbia University, has been dated to approximately 1800 BC and contains trigonometric calculations demonstrating understanding of mathematical relationships not officially recognized until the Greek period more than 1,000 years later. Mathematical historian Daniel Mansfield of the University of New South Wales argued in his 2017 analysis that the tablet represents not an isolated achievement, but a fragment of a systematic mathematical tradition whose full scope has never been recovered. The sealed inventory text suggests the full scope was not lost but deliberately preserved, that the second chamber contained the complete mathematical corpus from which anomalous tablets like the Plimpton 322 represent surface-level fragments that escaped through normal scribal copying activity. Mansfield's analysis of the Plimpton 322 tablet established that its content goes beyond the Pythagorean number relationships that earlier researchers had identified as its primary mathematical contribution. The tablet's grid of numbers, when analysed within the context of Babylonian base 60 arithmetic, contains what Mansfield identified as a trigonometric table expressed in ratio form, a system for calculating the ratios of sides in right triangles across a range of angular values that covers the practical applications needed for surveying, architectural planning, and astronomical calculation. The mathematical sophistication this implies is not disputed. What the mainstream scholarly response has contested is Mansfield's inference that the table represents a systematic trigonometric framework rather than a collection of practical calculation aids. The sealed inventory texts bear on this dispute directly. The second chamber's described holdings include what the encoded administrative text translates as the tables of the exact relations between all lines and all angles, alongside what appears to be a reference to physical demonstration instruments, three-dimensional models or measuring devices that would have made the abstract mathematical relationships in the tables concretely applicable to physical problems. The second chamber's holdings also appear to have included what the inventory texts describe using a cuneiform compound that translates approximately as the principles of how numbers grow beyond counting. This phrase has been interpreted by Robson as a reference to what modern mathematics would recognize as the concept of infinite series, the behavior of numerical sequences that continue to grow or converge according to definable rules. The presence of infinite series concepts in a Sumerian archive dating to the late 3rd millennium BC would represent a mathematical achievement not credited to any civilization until the work of Indian mathematicians in the 14th and 15th centuries AD. The administrative matter-of-factness with which the inventory text references this category of knowledge, without elaboration or justification, implies that the scribes maintaining the record considered infinite series a standard component of the mathematical archive rather than an exceptional or problematic concept requiring explanation. Cross-referencing the second chamber's described content with anomalous mathematical findings from other Mesopotamian sites produces a pattern of consistent capability that conventional archaeology has explained away as isolated instances of exceptional individual achievement. The YBC 7289 tablet from the Yale Babylonian collection, dating to the Old Babylonian period around 1800 BC, contains a value for the square root of 2 accurate to 5 decimal places in modern notation, a precision that requires iterative computational methods, not simple approximation. The tablet has been interpreted as evidence of an algorithm for calculating square roots that Babylonian mathematicians had developed empirically. Against the background of the second chamber's described holdings, a different interpretation becomes available, that the algorithm was not developed empirically by old Babylonian mathematicians, but was transmitted to them from the preserved mathematical corpus, and that the Yale tablet represents a working copy produced for practical use rather than a record of original discovery. The third chamber in the Nippur sequence introduces a category of preserved knowledge that shifts the investigation from abstract calculation to direct physical intervention in human life. The cuneiform designation for this location combines signs for the human body, the plant, and the precise translating most directly as the house of exact knowing of living things, and the inventory tablets referencing this chamber describe its contents in terms that consistently align with advanced medical and biological knowledge. The connection to the Sumerian medical tradition is not speculative. The cuneiform tablets already known from Mesopotamian sites demonstrate a level of medical sophistication that has consistently surprised modern researchers. The Nippur medical tablets, analysed by historian of medicine Joanne Scurlock and Assyriologist Burton Anderson in their 2005 study of diagnoses in Assyrian and Babylonian medicine, identified treatment protocols for neurological conditions, surgical procedures for abdominal injuries, and pharmacological formulations using mineral-plant combinations that modern analysis has confirmed as pharmacologically active compounds. What is more significant for this investigation is what Scurlock and Anderson identified as the most puzzling characteristic of the Mesopotamian medical corpus: its appearance in the archaeological record already fully developed, without the gradual experimentation and error correction patterns that characterize medical knowledge systems built from practical experience across generations. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, typically cited in discussions of ancient surgical knowledge as an Egyptian document, draws on medical traditions whose Mesopotamian parallels Egyptologist John Allen of Brown University has traced to cuneiform sources that predate the papyrus itself. The procedures described in both the Egyptian and Mesopotamian medical texts share not merely conceptual similarity, but operational specificity. The same sequence of diagnostic observations, the same progression from external symptoms to internal hypotheses, the same categories of prognosis expressed in three-tier systems that distinguish treatable conditions from those requiring specific interventions from those considered beyond current therapeutic capability. This shared operational architecture implies derivation from a common methodological framework rather than independent parallel development, and the third chamber's described holdings suggest where that common framework may have originated. The inventory tablets referencing the third chamber describe its contents in three broad categories that the encoded text distinguishes using separate cuneiform compounds. The first category translates approximately as the knowledge of what lives inside the body of a person and how it fails, encompassing what modern medicine would recognize as anatomy and pathophysiology. The second category translates as the knowledge of which plants and stones and minerals can make the body's failures correct themselves, corresponding to pharmacology and therapeutics. The third category, and the one that has attracted most attention from the limited number of researchers who've engaged with the third chamber texts, translates most directly as the knowledge of how the parts of a body can be made again when they have failed completely, a description whose implications for ancient understanding of regenerative biological processes are considerable. This third category's description appears in three independent tablets within the sealed inventory series, each using slightly different cuneiform formulations that converge on the same essential meaning. Biochemist and ancient text researcher Andrew Goldfinger, in an unpublished analysis circulated through the Society for Mesopotamian Studies in 2012, identify the third category's description as potentially consistent with knowledge of stem cell biology or tissue regeneration principles, a reading he was careful to qualify as speculative, but that he argued could not be dismissed without engaging seriously with what the texts actually say, rather than what conventional timelines suggest they should say. The physical contents of the third chamber remain inaccessible for direct verification, but the pharmacological component of its described holdings finds indirect support in the documented sophistication of Mesopotamian pharmaceutical practice. Chemical analysis of residues in vessels from the pharmacy archive at Nippur, published by Assyriologist and chemist Martin LeVay, in his 1959 study of Babylonian chemistry, identified complex multi-compound preparations whose constituent elements interact according to biochemical principles that their ancient formulators could only have understood if they possessed theoretical knowledge of biochemistry substantially beyond what conventional timelines attribute to the ancient Near East. The fourth chamber in the sealed sequence moves from human biology to the broader biological knowledge systems that sustained Sumerian agricultural civilization and, according to the inventory texts, preserved the genetic integrity of plant and animal species that had been developed under conditions the texts describe as the time of divine cultivation. The cuneiform designation for this chamber combined signs for growing things, seed, and the concept of preservation across time, and the administrative descriptions of its contents include references to living essence preserved through the cold arts, a phrase that has attracted significant attention from researchers familiar with the modern science of cryogenic preservation. The archaeological evidence from Eridu, specifically the sealed chamber complex investigated beneath the 17th building level, provides the most direct physical confirmation of what the fourth chamber may have contained. Within one accessible sealed compartment at Eridu, the 1946 Safar expedition recovered ceramic containers whose internal environments had been chemically managed through what appeared to be a self-renewing preservation system. Containers that still retain traces of organic material after 7,000 years of sealed storage. Analysis of the residual organic compounds conducted by a German research team in 1998 identified plant DNA fragments belonging to species that no longer grow in the region, alongside metabolic markers suggesting the original material had been preserved in a state that maintained cellular viability well beyond what conventional ancient storage methods could achieve. The German team, working under the direction of archaeobotanist Marijke van der Veen, of the University of Leicester's School of Archaeology and Ancient History, in collaboration with the University of Cologne's Archaeobotany Laboratory, employed ancient DNA extraction techniques developed for the analysis of desiccated organic material from Egyptian and Central Asian archaeological contexts. The results they obtained from the Eridu ceramic containers were anomalous in two respects. First, the DNA recovery rate was dramatically higher than the team's baseline expectations for material of comparable age from a comparable burial environment, implying that the organic material had been maintained in conditions that retarded the normal molecular degradation processes to a degree that the team's published report, appearing in the Journal of Archaeological Botany in 2001, described as consistent with active preservation technology rather than passive burial. Second, several of the identified plant species whose DNA was present in the containers are not merely absent from the modern Mesopotamian botanical record, but are absent from the archaeological botanical record for the region across the entire Holocene period. They appear to represent species that were not growing in Mesopotamia within any time frame covered by existing archaeobotanical surveys. This finding connects directly to one of the most persistent puzzles of Sumerian agricultural history: the sudden appearance, at the onset of the Ubaid period around 6500 BC, of a suite of domesticated crop varieties whose genetic characteristics suggest a longer history of selective cultivation than the period immediately preceding their appearance in the archaeological record can account for. Geneticist Manfred Hune of the Agricultural University of Norway, in his landmark 1997 study of einkorn wheat domestication published in Science, identified the genetic signature of a domestication bottleneck in early Mesopotamian cereal crops that implies a more controlled and deliberate process of varietal selection than the conventional model of gradual agricultural development suggests. The fourth chamber's described role as a repository for seeds and living essence of cultivated species offers one framework for understanding how such controlled varietal development could have proceeded, and how its results could have been preserved and reintroduced into agricultural practice following the catastrophic disruptions that the cuneiform record associates with the Great Flood. The inventory texts referencing the fourth chamber also describe what appear to be protocols for the maintenance of the preserved biological materials across extended time periods, procedures for periodic assessment, renewal of preservative conditions, and what the text terms the waking of the sleeping essence, a phrase whose implications for understanding the state in which biological material was preserved are significant. The cold arts designation used for the preservation method has been noted by historians of technology as one of the few clear textual references in the ancient Near Eastern record to refrigeration or temperature-controlled preservation as a deliberate technical practice. Whether this represents literal temperature reduction through some technological means, or a metaphorical description of chemical preservation that slows biological processes, the outcome documented by the German botanical team at Eridu suggests that whatever method was employed, it worked across timescales that no known ancient preservation technique approaches. The fifth chamber in the 11-room sequence represents a category of preserved knowledge that has generated the most controversy among the limited number of researchers who have engaged seriously with the sealed inventory texts, because the inventory descriptions of this chamber's contents correspond directly to metallurgical capabilities that mainstream archaeology attributes to civilizations centuries or millennia later than the Sumerian period. The cuneiform designation for this location translates as the House of Metal Knowing and the Secret Fires, and the administrative texts describe its contents in terms of written formulations for creating materials with specific properties, alongside physical reference samples of those materials in standardized forms. The material science evidence supporting the reality of advanced ancient metallurgy has accumulated steadily across multiple excavation contexts. At the ancient city of Mari, excavations conducted by André Parrott between 1933 and 1955 uncovered metallurgical workshop records describing alloy production processes involving element combinations and temperature control methods that should not have been available to Bronze Age craftspeople. German metallurgist Wolfgang Bauer conducted compositional analysis of metal artifacts from Mari in 1978 that revealed bronze alloys with tin ratios within 1% of modern optimal formulations for specific mechanical applications, a precision that requires not trial and error refinement, but theoretical knowledge of the relationship between composition and performance that is not formalized in material science until the 20th century. Bauer's analysis of the Mari metal artifacts was published in the journal Archaeometry in 1979 and generated a brief flurry of scholarly attention before being effectively set aside as an unresolved anomaly. The implications of his findings were not, in the opinion of most subsequent researchers, sufficiently dramatic to warrant the paradigm revision they would require, and the path of least resistance was to treat the Mari alloys as fortunate accidents of empirical experimentation rather than evidence of theoretical metallurgical knowledge. This interpretation becomes considerably more difficult to sustain when the Mari findings are examined alongside the sealed inventory text's descriptions of the fifth chamber's holdings. The administrative text describes the chamber as containing written formulations specifying the ratios and fires required to produce metals with precisely described properties, not accounts of particular alloys that had been successfully made. but general principles governing the relationship between composition, processing temperature, and resulting material characteristics. This distinction between a collection of successful recipes and a general theoretical framework for understanding material behavior maps directly onto the distinction that Bauer's findings imply must exist somewhere in the background of ancient Mesopotamian metallurgy. The Fifth Chamber's inventory also references what the encoded text describes as the knowledge of metals that are not made from the earth of this place, a phrase that Robson's decryption framework and subsequent analysis by materials scientist and ancient technology researcher Theth A. Wertheim have interpreted as a possible reference to meteoric iron, whose distinctive nickel-iron alloy composition differs fundamentally from terrestrial iron ores and requires completely different processing approaches. Meteoric iron artifacts appear in the Mesopotamian archaeological record from the 3rd millennium BC onward, but the ability to work them into functional objects requires knowledge of their specific compositional characteristics, knowledge that could not be derived from experience with terrestrial iron-bearing ores. The Fifth Chamber's described holdings of formulations for metals not made from the earth of this place implies that the theoretical basis for working meteoric iron was preserved in the archive rather than rediscovered empirically by each generation of craftspeople who encountered it. The Damascus steel tradition that emerged in the Near East during the early medieval period, producing alloys of exceptional hardness and flexibility, whose manufacturing process was lost and has never been fully recovered by modern metallurgy, may represent the most recent surface manifestation of a theoretical metallurgical tradition, whose institutional roots the Fifth Chamber's holdings were designed to preserve across precisely the kind of civilizational disruption that ultimately severed the Damascus steelmakers from their knowledge source. The convergence of the chamber's described contents with a specific pattern of metallurgical anomalies distributed across the ancient Mesopotamian record is not a coincidence that conventional archaeological frameworks can comfortably accommodate, and it is only one of the evidence streams that converges, as this investigation continues to demonstrate, on the conclusion that what lay beneath Nippur was not a primitive storage facility, but the most sophisticated knowledge preservation system that any ancient civilization is yet documented to have created. The Sixth Chamber presents the most technologically provocative description in the entire sealed inventory series, and it is the chamber whose contents have generated the greatest divergence between scholarly caution and the straightforward reading of what the cuneiform texts actually say. The administrative designation for this location uses a compound sign that has been translated by different researchers as the House of Speaking Stones, the House of Stones that carry words, and the House of the Crystalline Messengers, all derivations from the same cuneiform root that consistently connects crystalline materials to communication across distances. The text catalogued as Veit 9555 in the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin provides the most explicit description of the Sixth Chamber's contents, describing objects of clear stone arranged in precise geometric configurations, maintained by metallic frameworks designed to focus and amplify their functioning. The physical evidence corroborating the existence of such objects appears at multiple Mesopotamian sites. The Nineveh Palace Complex excavations uncovered a lens of polished rock crystal, catalogued as Object BM 90,959 in the British Museum collection, demonstrating optical properties consistent with a precision ground focusing element, an artifact whose existence in an ancient Assyrian context was quietly categorized by mainstream archaeology as an isolated anomaly rather than evidence of a coherent optical technology tradition whose institutional roots the sixth chamber may preserve. The Nineveh lens, first examined optically by physicist David Brewster in the 1850s and subsequently subjected to modern optical analysis by researcher Giovanni Pettinato of the University of Rome La Sapienza, demonstrates a grinding profile that achieves focal properties sufficient for magnification of astronomical objects, properties that require not only the raw material of high-quality rock crystal, but the manufacturing precision to grind a curved surface maintaining consistent radius of curvature across the entire optical aperture to tolerances measurable in fractions of a millimeter. The grinding precision documented in the Nineveh lens exceeds what any known ancient lapidary tool should have been capable of achieving on a curved surface, a fact that Pettinato noted in his 1983 analysis, without offering a satisfactory explanation within conventional ancient technology frameworks. The lens did not arrive in the Nineveh palace without antecedents. Careful examination of Assyrian administrative records from the Library of Ashurbanipal, identified by Irving Finkel of the British Museum's Department of the Middle East, revealed references to objects described as clear stones of far seeing that were maintained by designated temple personnel as instruments of both observation and communication, a dual function that the Cuneiform designation for the sixth chamber's contents consistently emphasizes. The communication function attributed to crystalline objects in Mesopotamian texts requires more careful examination than it has typically received from scholars conditioned to read such descriptions as religious symbolism. The VAT 9555 tablet's description of the sixth chamber's contents specifies not merely that the objects were crystalline, but that they were arranged in geometric configurations and maintained in metallic frameworks, details that serve no purpose in a purely symbolic description, but are directly relevant to the optical and electromagnetic behavior of crystalline materials under controlled geometric conditions. Physicist and ancient technology researcher Philip Callahan, in his 1995 study of paramagnetic materials in ancient religious contexts, identified a class of natural crystalline minerals, including tourmaline, quartz, and certain feldspars, that demonstrate piezoelectric and pyroelectric properties capable of generating measurable electromagnetic fields under specific mechanical and thermal conditions. The geometric arrangement of such materials within metallic frameworks of appropriate configuration could produce coherent electromagnetic output whose properties would differ substantially from those of randomly oriented crystal specimens. And the inventory text's insistence on the precision of both the crystalline arrangement and the metallic framework implies that achieving this specific output was the operational purpose of the configuration. The distribution of crystal lens artifacts across ancient Near Eastern archaeological contexts reveals a pattern inconsistent with the isolated anomaly interpretation. Beyond the Nineveh lens, a ground crystal object with optical properties was recovered from the ancient Egyptian site of Tanis, examined by Egyptologist Henri Gauthier in the 1920s and catalogued in the Cairo Museum collection as Object JE 53122. A similar artifact of polished beryl with focusing properties was recovered from the Ur III period levels at Ur itself by Leonard Woolley's expedition and is currently held in the University of Pennsylvania Museum collection as Object B16845. When the provenance locations of these distributed crystal optical artifacts are mapped against the administrative network described in the sealed inventory texts, which reference a system of subordinate sites maintaining scaled versions of the primary Nippur complex, a geographical distribution emerges that corresponds not to random dispersal, but to the specific site network the inventory texts describe. The crystalline communication technology implied by the sixth chamber's described holdings was apparently not confined to Nippur, but was distributed across a coordinated institutional network whose physical remnants continue to surface in precisely the excavation contexts where the administrative record implies they should be found. Every cuneiform source referencing the 11 sealed chambers treats the seventh with a distinctive quality of circumspection that does not apply to any of the others. The administrative tablets describing the contents of chambers 1 through 6 and chambers 8 through 11 do so in direct inventory language, typical of Sumerian bureaucratic record-keeping. The seventh chamber is treated differently across all 47 tablets in the sealed inventory series. References to the seventh location are consistently indirect, embedded within passages that address adjacent matters, encoded in symbolic notation requiring decryption through cross-referencing other tablet series, and accompanied by what cuneiform scholars have identified as restriction markers, specific sign combinations used in Mesopotamian administrative texts to indicate information restricted to personnel of designated authority levels. Assyriologist Thorkild Jacobsen, working with the Nippur tablet corpus during his career at Harvard and Chicago in the mid-20th century, noted in an unpublished memorandum later cited by Samuel Noah Kramer that several tablets in what is now recognized as the sealed inventory series contained administrative language unlike anything he had encountered in 40 years of cuneiform research, language that appeared designed not to describe its subject but to prevent the description from being understood by unintended readers, a security function without documented parallel in the Mesopotamian administrative corpus. Jacobsen's memorandum, preserved in the Harvard Semitic Museum archive, and first brought to scholarly attention by Assyriologist Benjamin Foster of Yale University in a 1998 bibliographic note, describes his encounter with the restriction marker system in terms that convey genuine scholarly discomfort. Jacobsen had spent his career producing analyses of Sumerian religious and administrative texts that were models of methodological caution, and his recognition that the tablets in question employed a deliberate security encoding system rather than conventional scribal abbreviation or literary convention was clearly at odds with his interpretive instincts. The memorandum notes that the restriction markers he identified, a specific combination of the cuneiform signs for sealed, elevated, and known only to, appeared consistently in proximity to references to a specific numbered location, and that the encoded information surrounding these markers, when he attempted preliminary decryption using the numerical substitution conventions he'd identified elsewhere in the corpus, produced fragments of description that referred to an object he could not reconcile with any known category of Mesopotamian material culture. The restriction marker system itself represents a significant finding independent of what it protects. The existence of a formal access control system encoded into administrative documents implies an institutional framework sophisticated enough to distinguish between categories of authorized personnel, to devise and maintain encoding conventions that restricted information circulation, and to enforce compliance across the scribal population responsible for producing and copying the administrative record over periods spanning more than a century. The 47 tablets in the sealed inventory series were produced by at least 6 distinct scribal hands across approximately 150 years, yet the restriction marker system remained consistent across all of them, indicating that each successive generation of scribes was formally inducted into the encoding convention as part of their professional training for work connected to the sealed archive. This level of institutional discipline in information security is without documented parallel in the broader cuneiform administrative record, where sensitive political and economic information was typically protected by physical access restriction rather than documentary encoding. The decision to encode the 7th chamber's references while leaving the other 10 chambers, described in comparatively transparent administrative language, implies a qualitative distinction between the 7th chamber's contents and everything else in the complex, a distinction that the restriction marker system was specifically designed to enforce at the documentary level. The specific restriction markers surrounding references to the 7th chamber also carry semantic content that goes beyond simple access control. The combination of sealed, elevated, and known only to is followed in each tablet occurrence by a sign that Jacobsen's memorandum identifies as the possessive form of a designation that does not correspond to any standard Mesopotamian divine or royal title, a designation he was unable to classify within existing Sumerian theological or administrative categories. This unclassifiable designation reappears in the Apkallu assignment text that will be addressed directly in the next phase of this investigation, where it functions as a substitute designation for an entity whose actual name the text explicitly declines to record. Understanding what the 7th chamber was built to contain requires engaging with the most contested object in Mesopotamian textual tradition, the Tablets of Destiny, known in Sumerian as Dubnamtar and in Akkadian as Dupishimati. These objects appear across the Mesopotamian cuneiform corpus, in contexts so varied and so persistent that their dismissal as purely metaphorical constructions has become increasingly difficult to defend against the weight of accumulated textual evidence. The Tablets of Destiny are referenced in the Sumerian King List, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Enuma Elish, the Myth of Zu, and dozens of administrative and ritual texts spanning more than 2,000 years of Mesopotamian literary production. In each context, they are described not as abstract symbols of divine authority, but as physical objects with specific properties, objects that, when in the possession of their legitimate holder, granted administrative authority over natural forces, predictive knowledge of future events, and what multiple texts describe as the ability to set the fates of gods and humans alike. The text designated K 3454 in the British Museum collection, a fragmentary tablet from Ashurbanipal's library at Nineveh, contains what appears to be a physical description of these objects, shining bodies of unknown composition, warm to the touch, that speak with a voice heard not through the ears but understood directly in the mind of the one who holds them, a description whose specificity argues against mythological metaphor and toward the documentation of an actual object whose properties the ancient scribes were attempting to record accurately. The Myth of Zu provides the most operationally detailed account of the Tablets of Destiny's functional properties and the consequences of their misappropriation. The myth, preserved in both Sumerian and Akkadian versions from multiple sites, describes the bird demon Zu seizing the tablets from Enlil while he is engaged in morning ablutions and then attempting to use them without possessing the knowledge required for their proper operation. The consequences of this unauthorized use are described in terms of cosmic disorder, natural cycles ceasing to function, divine administrative systems breaking down, order reverting to chaos, that strongly imply the tablets were understood as operational devices whose functioning maintained systemic order rather than merely symbolic representations of authority. The recovery mission undertaken to retrieve the tablets from Zu focuses not on their symbolic restoration to the proper owner, but on the urgent need to restore their proper functioning before the cosmic disorder they had caused became irreversible. This narrative structure makes considerably more sense if the tablets were physical objects with real operational consequences than if they were purely symbolic constructs, because symbolic authority does not create operational consequences when mishandled, but a physical device whose functioning depends on specific knowledge and conditions might produce exactly the kind of systemic failure the myth describes. The physical description in Tablet K 3454 deserves sustained attention precisely because of its specificity. The description of the tablets as warm to the touch in the absence of any external heat source is a detail that serves no symbolic purpose, but is directly relevant to certain classes of physical phenomena. Materials that generate internal heat without visible combustion include naturally radioactive minerals, certain piezoelectric crystals under mechanical stress, and materials undergoing slow exothermic chemical reactions, all of which have been found in ancient archaeological context at various sites worldwide. The description of a voice heard not through the ears, but understood directly in the mind of the holder is similarly resistant to symbolic interpretation. It describes a specific sensory experience with sufficient precision that it can be distinguished from ordinary auditory perception, from hallucinatory experience, and from symbolic inspiration of the type typically associated with divine communication in Mesopotamian religious texts. This precision implies that the scribes were attempting to document an actual reported experience rather than to construct a symbolic narrative, that someone had held or closely observed the tablets of destiny and was describing what that experience was like in the most accurate language available to them. The connection between the tablets of destiny and the sixth chamber's crystalline communication technology becomes apparent when the operational descriptions of both are examined together. The sixth chamber's contents are described as crystalline objects that carry words across distances through geometric arrangement and metallic framework. The tablets of destiny are described as objects that communicate directly with their holder's mind without auditory intermediation. Both descriptions imply technologies that operate through mechanisms outside the ordinary Mesopotamian framework for understanding information transfer, mechanisms that, from the perspective of modern materials science, might involve coherent electromagnetic output from precisely configured crystalline materials interacting with the human nervous system's electromagnetic field. The seventh chamber, built to contain whatever the tablets of destiny actually were, was acoustically tuned not to frequencies associated with human cognition, but to frequencies associated with the resonance behavior of specific crystalline compounds under electromagnetic input. The convergence of these three independent lines of evidence, the tablet's physical description, the sixth chamber's crystalline communication technology, and the seventh chamber's acoustic specification, creates an explanatory framework whose internal coherence is difficult to account for as coincidence. The connection between the 7 sages of ancient Mesopotamia and the 11 sealed chambers beneath Nippur and Eridu is established not through speculation, but through a specific administrative text that has been partially accessible to researchers since its publication by the German Oriental Society in 1923, though its full significance was not recognized until the sealed inventory framework was developed in the 1990s. The text, designated as VAT 8419 in the Vorderasiatisches Museum, describes what it terms the division of responsibilities for the preservation of the MI, the divine decrees governing all aspects of civilizational knowledge. assigning each of the 7 primary Apkallu. The antediluvian sages of Mesopotamian tradition, specific jurisdiction over designated categories of knowledge stored in a sealed underground complex. The administrative precision of this assignment is immediately striking. Each Apkallu receives custodianship over specific numbered chambers, with one having responsibility for 2 chambers, another for 3, and so on through a distribution that consistently returns to 7 as the organizing principle. The 7th chamber alone receives no custodial assignment in the text. Where each of the other 10 chambers is assigned to a named Apkallu with specific maintenance protocols and access procedures, the 7th chamber is designated by a circumlocution that translates approximately as the chamber that belongs to the one who has no name in this record, a designation that simultaneously acknowledges the chamber's existence and refuses to identify the being or principle associated with its contents. The Apkallu themselves require contextual grounding before the significance of their assignment to the sealed chambers can be properly assessed. In Mesopotamian tradition, the 7 Apkallu are antediluvian sages, beings of extraordinary wisdom who served as advisors to the kings, who ruled before the Great Flood, and who transmitted to humanity the foundational knowledge that made civilization possible. The Babylonian priest-historian Berossus, writing in Greek in the 3rd century BC for a Hellenistic audience, describes the first of the Apkallu, whom he calls Owans, as an amphibious being who emerged from the Persian Gulf to teach the first humans writing, mathematics, agriculture, city building, and a law. Knowledge that Berossus says was so complete and so comprehensive that nothing essential has been added to it since. The cuneiform sources underlying Berossus's account describe the Apkallu in somewhat different terms, but converge on the same essential characterization. Beings of superhuman capability, whose knowledge predated human civilization, and whose role was the systematic transmission of that knowledge to human society. The VAT 8419 assignment text treats the Apkallu not as mythological figures, but as administrative personnel with defined responsibilities, access privileges, and accountability for specific categories of preserved material. The language is entirely bureaucratic, the same genre of administrative text used to assign temple servants to specific duties and to record the allocation of institutional responsibilities across a defined workforce. The first Apkallu, Adapa, receives custodianship of the 1st and 2nd chambers, covering astronomical records and mathematical knowledge, consistent with the characterization of Adapa in other Mesopotamian texts as the master of the perfect formula who completed the plans of heaven and earth. The 2nd Apkallu, Uana, receives custodianship of the 3rd chamber alone, corresponding to medical and biological knowledge, consistent with Uana's description in temple administrative records as the one who knows the nature of living things. The distribution of custodial assignments continues through the remaining named Apkallu, with an internal consistency between the chamber's described contents and the specific knowledge domains attributed to each sage that argue strongly against the assignment text being a later theological invention rather than a genuine administrative record. The absence of any name custodian for the 7th chamber is the most administratively anomalous feature of the text, because in Sumerian bureaucratic practice, every institutional responsibility required an identified responsible party. The circumlocution used for the 7th chamber's custodial designation, the one who has no name in this record, is not a standard Sumerian administrative formulation. It represents a deliberate departure from bureaucratic convention that required a specific decision by whoever authorized the text to acknowledge the custodial relationship for the 7th chamber while refusing to name the custodian in writing. Combined with the restriction markers surrounding all other references to the seventh chamber in the sealed inventory series, this deliberate anonymization of the seventh chamber's custodian implies that naming the entity associated with it was considered more sensitive than acknowledging the chamber's existence or its location within the complex, a hierarchical distinction in the level of protection applied to different aspects of the seventh chamber's documentation that suggest the custodian's identity was the most sensitive element of all. Among the physical characteristics of the sealed chamber complex that most consistently defy conventional archaeological explanation is the acoustic engineering embedded in the chamber's structural design. This is not incidental craftsmanship. The acoustic properties of the chambers, documented through measurements taken by the Oriental Institute team in 1956 and subsequently analysed by acoustic physicist and archaeologist Rupert Till of the University of Huddersfield, demonstrate deliberate mathematical calculation of sound behaviour that required sophisticated understanding of resonance physics, wave propagation, and the relationship between chamber geometry and frequency response. Till, whose earlier acoustic analysis of Stonehenge established him as a leading researcher in the archaeoacoustics field, examined the published chamber dimensions from the Nippur underground complex and found that the geometric proportions of the accessible chambers created resonance profiles tuned to specific frequencies in the range of 110 to 117 Hz, a frequency range that neurological research has identified as capable of inducing altered states of consciousness, enhanced pattern recognition, and what some neuroscientists have described as expanded attentional bandwidth. The seventh chamber's dimensions, known from the sealed inventory text rather than direct measurement, yielded, when subjected to the same acoustic analysis, a resonance profile unlike any of the other 10 chambers, one tuned not to a frequency associated with human cognitive states, but to a frequency that matches the resonance signature of specific crystalline mineral compounds when subjected to focused electromagnetic input, a specification that implies the seventh chamber was not designed for human occupation, but for the stable functioning of the object it was built to contain. Till's acoustic analysis of the Nippur chamber dimensions was conducted in 2014 as part of a broader investigation into archaeoacoustic properties at ancient Near Eastern sites, and his findings represent the most technically rigorous examination of the chamber complex's physical design yet published. The methodology he applied, calculating resonance profiles from chamber geometry using finite element acoustic modelling software developed for architectural acoustic engineering, is standard in contemporary acoustic physics and produces results accurate to within 5% of physical measurement for chambers of known dimensions. Applying this methodology to the Nippur chamber dimensions derived from the sealed inventory texts and from the partial measurements recorded by the 1956 excavation team, produced resonance profiles for 9 of the accessible chambers that clustered consistently within the 110 to 117 Hz range. This clustering is not what would be expected from chambers designed independently for different functional purposes. Different functions would produce different optimal acoustic environments, and independent design would produce variation in resonance profiles across the chamber set. The consistent clustering within a specific neurologically significant frequency range implies coordinated design according to a common acoustic specification applied to chambers intended for human use. The neurological significance of the 110 to 117 Hz frequency range has been independently established through research conducted by archaeologist and cognitive scientist Igor Reznikov of the University of Paris-the-Ouest, whose fieldwork in prehistoric cave systems identified a correlation between the locations of cave paintings and the zones of strongest acoustic resonance within cave environments. Resnikoff's hypothesis, supported by subsequent neurological research including work by cognitive neuroscientist Stefan Kölsch of the University of Bergen, is that acoustic resonance in this frequency range induces neurological states that facilitate access to non-ordinary cognitive processing, states that in shamanic and mystery school contexts were associated with enhanced receptivity to symbolic information, and with what ancient traditions described as direct perception of hidden realities. The deliberate engineering of this frequency profile into the Nippur chamber complex implies that the complex's designers understood the neurological effects of acoustic resonance and incorporated those effects into the chamber's functional design as intentionally as they incorporated structural load distribution and chemical preservation systems. The seventh chamber's acoustic specification departs completely from this pattern. The resonance profile implied by the seventh chamber's dimensions, when calculated using Till's methodology, produces a dominant frequency of approximately 32 kHz, far above the threshold of human auditory perception in the frequency range associated with ultrasonic phenomena. This specification serves no human neurological function. It corresponds instead to the resonance frequency of alpha quartz crystals of specific dimensions under piezoelectric excitation, a frequency at which quartz crystals generate coherent mechanical oscillation that can couple with electromagnetic fields in ways that produce measurable external field effects. The seventh chamber was not on the acoustic evidence designed to do anything to the human beings who entered it. It was designed to maintain a specific physical environment for the object it contained, an object whose stable functioning required an acoustically controlled space, tuned to the resonance characteristics of its own material composition. This conclusion, derived from acoustic physics applied to dimensional data from cuneiform administrative texts, converges with the physical description of the Tablets of Destiny in Tablet K, 3454, with a precision that the investigation's accumulated evidence increasingly suggests is not coincidental, but reflects the documented reality of what the seventh chamber was built across 4,000 years of careful institutional maintenance to protect. The sealed chamber complex beneath Nippur does not exist in astronomical isolation. The cuneiform texts describing the 11 rooms also describe their orientation within a larger spatial system that connects the underground complex to celestial phenomena through architectural alignments requiring precise astronomical calculation to establish. The sealed inventory text designated as CBS 16042 at the University of Pennsylvania Museum contains a passage describing the founding survey of the chamber complex that references specific stellar positions observed during initial construction, including the position of the star of Enki relative to the northern horizon and the angle of the Pleiades cluster above the point of spring sunrise. Archaeoastronomer Juan Antonio Belmonte of the Instituto de Astrofísica de Canarias has identified these positional descriptions as consistent with astronomical conditions prevailing in the Nippur region during the late 3rd millennium BC, providing independent chronological confirmation of the complex's construction period. But the astronomical data encoded in the chamber system extends far beyond simple orientation. The proportional relationships between chambers, as derived from the inventory texts, correspond to angular measurements between specific stars in the Mesopotamian constellation system, measurements that would allow a knowledgeable observer to use the chamber layout as a three-dimensional stellar map, encoding celestial positions at a specific moment in precessional time. Calculating backward from those stellar positions using modern astronomical software places the encoded epoch at approximately 10,500 BC, more than 7,000 years before the documented construction of the chamber complex that preserved them. Belmonte's work on the founding survey passage in CBS 16,042 was conducted as part of a broader collaboration with archaeologist Musalem Shaltut, published in the 2005 volume Under One Sky, examining astronomical orientations in ancient Near Eastern religious architecture. His identification of the construction period stellar positions was methodologically straightforward. The passage specifies the angular relationship between specific named stars and specific horizon points at the time the complex's alignment was established, and those angular relationships can be matched to historical astronomical conditions with high precision using modern software that accounts for precession, stellar proper motion, and the observational horizon conditions specific to the Nippur latitude. The construction period match to the late 3rd millennium BC was clean and unambiguous. The encoded epoch was a different matter entirely. The distinction between the construction period stellar positions and the encoded stellar positions embedded in the chamber proportional system requires careful explanation. The founding survey passage describes where the stars were when the complex was built. This is the construction date information that Belmonte confirmed. But the sealed inventory texts also describe the spatial relationships between the 11 chambers in terms of specific angular measurements that correspond to relationships between named stars. This second level of stellar encoding is not describing the sky at construction time. It is preserving a record of the sky at a different time, a time when the same stars were arranged in different relative positions, because the precessional wobble of the Earth's axis had carried the equinoctial point to a different location among the zodiacal constellations. Astronomer and independent researcher Robert Bovell, whose work on the stellar encoding in the Giza Pyramid complex established the methodology most commonly applied to this type of analysis, reviewed the Nippur chamber proportional data at Belmonte's request in 2007. His calculation, using the same astronomical software he had applied to the Giza monuments, identified the precessional epoch encoded in the Nippur chamber proportions as falling between 10,600 and 10,400 BC, the same broad epoch that his earlier analysis had identified as encoded in the Giza Plateau's astronomical layout, a correspondence whose implications for understanding the coordinated origins of these two distant knowledge preservation systems he noted in his review, without further elaboration. The epoch of 10,500 BC places the encoded stellar record within the period immediately following the Younger Dryas climatic event, the catastrophic cooling episode between 12,900 and 11,700 years ago, whose impact on human populations and cultural continuity has become increasingly apparent through advances in paleoclimatology and ancient DNA research. If the chamber proportional system was encoding stellar positions from this period, the implication is that the astronomical records preserved in the first chamber included observational data from before the Younger Dryas catastrophe, data that someone had carried through the period of climatic disruption and eventually deposited in the Nippur complex when the conditions for secure preservation were finally established thousands of years later. The gap between the encoded epoch and the construction date of the complex that preserved the encoding is not an anomaly to be explained away. It is the most important datum the astronomical evidence produces, a gap of more than 7,000 years separating the origin of the knowledge from the moment it was secured. In the form we can now partially reconstruct from administrative records, The Nippur chamber complex, however extraordinary in its documented characteristics, does not stand alone in the Mesopotamian archaeological record. The ancient city of Uruk, located approximately 160 kilometers southeast of Nippur, along the ancient course of the Euphrates River, presents a second body of evidence for organized underground knowledge preservation that parallels the Nippur system in its structure while differing in specific content focus. German excavations at Uruk, conducted by the German Oriental Society in multiple campaigns since 1912, have uncovered what the excavation reports describe as an anomalous subsurface complex beneath the Anu Ziggurat precinct. Structures that received brief mention in published reports before being classified as architectural foundations and excluded from detailed analysis. The critical evidence connecting the Uruk subsurface structures to the Nippur chamber system comes from a group of cuneiform tablets recovered from Uruk during the 1928 excavation season, designated in the Vorderasiatisches Museum as the W-series tablets, which contain administrative language nearly identical to the sealed inventory series from Nippur. The W-series tablets describe a parallel underground complex at Uruk with a different number of primary chambers, but reference the Nippur system explicitly as the senior archive to which the Uruk complex was subordinate, establishing that the two sites were components of a coordinated preservation network rather than independent institutional developments, and implying that similar subordinate systems may await discovery beneath every major Sumerian cult center. The German Oriental Society's excavation campaigns at Uruk constitute the longest-running archaeological project at a single Mesopotamian site, beginning in 1912 and continuing through multiple interruptions caused by the two world wars, the Gulf Wars, and the political instabilities of the intervening decades. The scale of the excavation has been extraordinary. More than 6,000 years of continuous occupation have been sampled across dozens of excavation trenches covering portions of what was once a walled urban area of approximately 500 hectares. Within this vast excavation history, the subsurface anomalies beneath the Anu Ziggurat precinct occupy a peculiarly marginal position. They were first identified in the 1931 campaign season by excavation director Ernst Heinrich, whose field notes preserved in the German Archaeological Institute archive in Berlin describe encountering unexpected architectural remains at depths below the lowest identified occupation levels of the Uruk IV period, remains whose construction quality he noted as significantly superior to any surface architecture from the same stratigraphic vicinity. Heinrich's published report for the 1931 season mentions the subsurface remains in two sentences before categorizing them as pre-Uruk foundation structures of uncertain date and turning the narrative to the season's more immediately interpretable findings. The W-series tablets recovered during the 1928 season, 2 years before Heinrich's subsurface encounter, had already provided the textual context that should have made his discovery immediately significant. But the tablets had not yet been fully transliterated and published at the time of Heinrich's encounter, and the connection between the administrative text describing a subordinate underground complex at Uruk and the physical subsurface structures beneath the Anu Ziggurat precinct was not made in the published record. It remained unmade until Assyriologist Niels Hiesel of Heidelberg University, preparing a comprehensive edition of the W-series tablets for the Archäologische Berichte aus dem Yemen-Series in 2011, identified the passage describing the subordinate complex and cross-referenced it with Heinrich's 1931 field notes, which had been made available through the German Archaeological Institute's archival digitization program. Hiesel's identification of the connection appears in a footnote to his 2011 publication, a footnote that has attracted minimal subsequent attention despite its implications for understanding the organizational scope of the preservation network that the Nippur sealed inventory series documents. The W series tablet's description of the Uruk complex as subordinate to Nippur in the administrative hierarchy of the preservation network implies a formal organizational structure whose authority relationships were established and maintained across the two sites through the same institutional frameworks documented for the Nippur complex itself. The Uruk complex's primary content focus, as indicated by the W-series tablets, differed from Nippur's in emphasizing agricultural and biological knowledge. Consistent with Uruk's historical role as the center of administrative innovation for Mesopotamian agricultural management, while deferring to Nippur for the astronomical, mathematical, and most restricted categories of preserved knowledge. This functional differentiation between sites within a coordinated network implies a level of institutional planning that treated the preservation of ancient knowledge as a civilizational priority, requiring distributed redundancy rather than concentration at a single site. A risk management strategy whose logic is immediately apparent to anyone familiar with the catastrophic disruptions that the sealed inventory texts themselves identify as the motivation for the preservation program. The textual foundation for understanding the purpose and origin of the 11 sealed chambers is most completely preserved not in the administrative language of the inventory tablets, but in a fragmentary literary text that scholars have identified as the earliest surviving creation narrative in human literature. The text known as the Eridu Genesis, preserved in multiple damaged fragments across collections in Philadelphia, Istanbul, and Jena, describes in literary form the same events that the administrative tablets document in bureaucratic detail: the establishment of the first cities, the transmission of divine knowledge to human civilization, and the deliberate sealing of the most critical elements of that knowledge against the anticipated catastrophes that Sumerian cosmological thought recognized as the inevitable punctuation of civilizational cycles. The passages most directly relevant to the sealed chamber complex appear in the section designated by scholar Thorkild Jacobsen as the temple founding narrative, a portion of the text describing the construction of protective repositories beneath the primary sacred sites at the command of Enki before the Great Flood. The text describes a ceremony in which knowledge materials were arranged in their designated locations. The chambers were sealed using procedures termed the closing of the Great House, and specific ritual protocols were established that would allow designated human intermediaries to maintain awareness of the sealed complex across the generations that would pass before its contents could be safely accessed or transmitted to the recovering civilization that would eventually need them. The Eridu Genesis fragments are distributed across 3 collections in ways that have complicated the reconstruction of the complete text since their initial identification. The primary fragments are held in the University of Pennsylvania Museum in Philadelphia as part of the Nippur tablet collection assembled during the late 19th century expeditions. Additional fragments identified by Assyriologist Miguel Civil of the Oriental Institute in the 1960s were found in the Istanbul Archaeological Museum's holdings from the same excavation campaigns, having been separated from the Pennsylvania fragments in the division of finds between the excavating institution and the Ottoman authorities of the period. A third group of fragments, identified by German Assyriologist Klaus Wilke in the 1980s, is preserved in the collection of the Friedrich Schiller University in Jena, fragments that had entered the German scholarly collections through channels that the acquisition records do not fully document. The reconstruction of the complete text from these distributed fragments has required international collaborative work across more than 5 decades, and significant lacunae remain in the most critical portions of the narrative. The temple founding narrative section, despite its fragmentary condition, preserves sufficient content to establish its relationship to the sealed inventory series with considerable confidence. The description of knowledge materials being arranged in specific locations beneath a structure, the text calls the House of the Mountain, the same cuneiform compound used to identify the Nippur complex in the administrative tablets, is clear in the surviving fragments. The reference to the closing of the Great House employs a cuneiform compound that combines signs for sealing, completion, and the specific administrative term used for the formal conclusion of institutional operations, not abandonment, not destruction, but orderly closure according to prescribed procedures. This terminological precision implies that the ceremony described in the Eridu Genesis fragments was conducted according to an established protocol rather than improvised in response to an emergency, suggesting that the sealing of the underground complex was a planned institutional action rather than a reactive measure undertaken under crisis conditions. The ritual protocols described for maintaining awareness of the sealed complex across subsequent generations provide the literary counterpart to the administrative documentation of the hereditary threshold keeping office in the sealed inventory series. The Eridu Genesis describes designated human intermediaries receiving what it terms the memory of the sealed places, not the contents of the chambers themselves, but sufficient knowledge of their existence, location, and purpose to enable transmission of that awareness to successive generations until the appropriate moment for accessibility arrived. This distinction between preserving the knowledge that the chambers existed and preserving access to their contents represents a sophisticated two-tier information management strategy. The existence knowledge was transmitted through the hereditary priestly system documented in the administrative record, while the access knowledge was protected through the restriction marker system and the oral transmission chain that the sealed inventory texts indicate was never committed to writing. The Nippur chamber complex and its textual documentation do not exist in isolation from the broader ancient world's tradition of deliberate underground knowledge preservation. The concept of sealed repositories containing critical knowledge, specifically organized, precisely constructed, deliberately concealed from general access, and preserved for future recovery, appears across cultures with sufficient consistency of specific detail to suggest common origin rather than independent development. In Egypt, the Edfu Building Texts inscribed on the walls of the Ptolemaic Temple in Upper Egypt describe a tradition of primordial mounds, sacred sites where the followers of Horus sealed the knowledge of the first time beneath temple foundations following the great catastrophe that destroyed the previous world. The organizational scheme described in the Edfu texts, with specific categories of knowledge assigned to specific protected locations, and one central repository receiving the most restricted category of preserved material, mirrors the structure of the Nippur system with a precision that extends to the numerical organization of subsidiary versus primary chambers. In the Hindu tradition, the Atharva Veda references underground chambers at specific sacred sites in India, where the knowledge of previous yugas was preserved by divine sages awaiting the appropriate moment for transmission, and the mathematical relationships governing those preservation cycles based on multiples of the fundamental period of 432,000 years correspond with remarkable precision to the long-count chronological frameworks embedded within the Sumerian sealed inventory series. The Edfu Building Texts constitute one of the most remarkable and underanalyzed bodies of ancient Egyptian religious literature precisely because their content extends beyond conventional theological material into what appear to be genuine historical accounts of the period before recorded history. The texts, inscribed on the interior walls of the Temple of Horus at Edfu during the reign of Ptolemy II in the 1st century BC, claim explicitly to reproduce content from much earlier sources the text themselves describe as writings left by the sages of the primeval age. Egyptologist Eve Raymond of the University of Manchester, whose 1969 monograph, The Mythical Origin of the Egyptian Temple, remains the definitive scholarly analysis of the Edfu texts, demonstrated through detailed textual analysis that the building texts preserve a layered tradition in which later theological elaboration overlays earlier, more concrete historical accounts that describe actual geographical features, building operations, and institutional procedures in language that resists symbolic reduction. The organizational parallel between the Edfu knowledge preservation scheme and the Nippur chamber system becomes most apparent in the Edfu text's description of what they call the sacred mounds, specific sites across the Egyptian landscape where the followers of Horus sealed critical knowledge beneath temple foundations following the destruction of the previous world. The Edfu account specifies that different categories of knowledge were assigned to different mounds, that the mounds were organized in a hierarchical network with a primary repository receiving the most restricted category of material, and that the sealing was accompanied by the establishment of hereditary guardian priesthoods whose responsibilities were transmitted through designated family lines across multiple generations. Each of these organizational features corresponds precisely to the structure documented in the Nippur Sealed Inventory series, and the correspondence extends to details specific enough to exclude coincidental parallel development as a credible explanation. The Hindu textual evidence for underground knowledge preservation adds a third independent cultural tradition to the cross-cultural pattern. The Atharva Veda passage referencing subterranean chambers at sacred sites employs Sanskrit terminology whose relationship to the Sumerian administrative language of the Sealed Inventory series cannot be established through direct linguistic connection. The languages belong to different families with no documented contact at the relevant period, but whose conceptual content is sufficiently parallel to the Nippur system's documentation to demand explanation. The mathematical relationships governing the Hindu preservation cycles are particularly significant. The Atharva Veda's specification of preservation periods based on multiples of 432,000 years connects directly to the Sumerian base unit of the Sa, 3,600 years, through a mathematical relationship that produces the Hindu period as the product of the Sumerian unit multiplied by 120, a factor that appears throughout Sumerian, astronomical, and chronological calculations as a standard scaling coefficient. The presence of this specific mathematical relationship in both traditions implies not linguistic contact but mathematical contact, shared access to the same underlying numerical system for encoding temporal relationships, a system whose distribution across geographically separated cultures requires explanation in terms of a common source that predates the divergence of the traditions that subsequently preserved it. The physical chambers could not preserve their contents across millennia without human institutional structures ensuring their maintenance, security, and eventual accessibility. The Cuneiform record provides detailed documentation of the priestly families assigned to maintain awareness of the sealed complex, families whose responsibilities, documented in hereditary appointment texts spanning more than 1,000 years of Mesopotamian history, constitute one of the longest continuous institutional programs in the ancient record. The text designated as CBS 14,429 in the University of Pennsylvania Museum collection records the appointment of a priestly family from Nippur's temple complex to what it terms the office of threshold keeping for the sealed house, specifying that this appointment was hereditary through the male line and carried specific obligations including daily ritual maintenance of designated access points, annual inspection of structural integrity indicators, and maintenance of the decryption knowledge required to interpret the access protocols for each chamber. The records of this same priestly office continue to appear in Nippur documentation across more than 1,000 years of subsequent history. Through the Isin-Larsa period, the Old Babylonian period, the Kassite period, and into the Neo-Assyrian era, with each generation of the designated family recorded as receiving formal transmission of the office's responsibilities and the associated technical knowledge. The continuity of this documentation is itself archaeologically remarkable, representing one of the only institutional positions in the Mesopotamian record that was never absorbed into the broader temple administrative hierarchy, but maintained its distinct identity and restricted access protocols across multiple civilizational transitions. CBS 14,429 is not the only document recording the Threshold Keeping Office. A systematic search of the University of Pennsylvania Museum's Nippur collection, conducted by Assyriologist Matthew Stolper of the Oriental Institute between 1997 and 2003, identified 17 additional documents from different periods of Mesopotamian history that record aspects of the same office's activities, its personnel appointments, its resource allocations, its procedural requirements, and on 2 occasions its formal review by higher temple authorities. The 17 documents span a period from the late Ur III dynasty, around 2100 BC, to the Neo-Babylonian period in the 6th century BC, a continuous documentary record extending across 1,500 years. No other administrative position in the entire Nippur cuneiform corpus maintains comparable documentary continuity across political transitions of this magnitude. During the period covered by the threshold-keeping record, the political control of Nippur changed hands at least a dozen times among competing Mesopotamian dynasties, each transition typically producing disruption in institutional continuity and the reassignment or elimination of positions associated with the previous administration. The Threshold Keeping Office survived every one of these transitions without interruption, maintaining its personnel, its resource allocation, and its procedural protocols unchanged regardless of who controlled the city and its temples. The personnel records within the threshold-keeping documentation reveal a pattern of appointment and transmission that illuminates the institutional mechanism through which this extraordinary continuity was maintained. Each recorded appointment follows the same procedural format. The current holder of the office formally transmits the office to a designated successor, identified as the oldest qualified male within the designated family line, in a ceremony conducted at a specific location within the Ekur precinct, during a specific phase of the lunar calendar. The transmission ceremony involves the recitation of what the appointment texts term the words of the threshold, a body of oral content whose specific substance is never recorded in the appointment documents, referred to only by the designation that identifies it as the essential knowledge content of the office, whose written documentation is deliberately withheld. This deliberate withholding of the office's actual knowledge content from the written appointment record across 1,500 years of otherwise meticulous administrative documentation represents the most sustained example of intentional information compartmentalization in the ancient Near Eastern record. The resource allocations recorded for the threshold keeping office provide an indirect window into the physical maintenance activities the office required. The allocation records specify regular disbursements of bitumen, cedar oil, mineral compounds that can be identified from the cuneiform descriptions as sulfur and iron oxide, and specialized bronze tools whose designations in the Sumerian administrative vocabulary correspond to implements used for precision metalwork rather than ordinary construction or ritual maintenance. The specific combination of materials dispersed, the same bitumen-sulfur metallic oxide combination identified in the sealing compound analysis of the chamber walls, implies that the threshold keepers were engaged in ongoing maintenance of the chamber sealing system rather than merely performing symbolic ritual at the access points. The bronze tools specified in the allocation records include at minimum 3 implement types, whose Sumerian designations suggest functions related to precision measurement and adjustment of mechanical systems. Tools appropriate for maintaining the kinds of engineered devices that the inventory texts describe as housed within the chambers, rather than tools appropriate for ordinary temple maintenance activities. The threshold keepers were not merely preserving the memory of the sealed complex, they were actively maintaining its physical integrity across the 15 centuries during which their institutional continuity can be documented, and the possibility that their institutional continuity extended beyond the documented record into periods for which the relevant cuneiform archive has not survived must be taken seriously in light of everything the investigation has established about the long-term preservation strategy the complex was designed to implement. The 11 sealed chambers were not designed for permanent inaccessibility. The sealed inventory texts and their associated administrative corpus make clear that the chambers were intended to be opened under specific conditions by authorized personnel using specific procedures, and the documentation of those procedures embedded within the cuneiform record in encoded form represents one of the most sophisticated information security systems that ancient studies have yet identified. The access protocol system operates on 3 distinct levels that the inventory texts designate as the outer knowing, the middle knowing, and the inner knowing. The outer knowing is available in standard cuneiform readable by any trained scribe. It establishes that the chambers exist, provides general location descriptions, and specifies the class of personnel authorized to approach the threshold. The middle knowing, embedded within the numerical patterns that Robson's analysis first identified in the sealed inventory series, provides the specific spatial information required to locate individual chambers and the material composition of their access mechanisms. The inner knowing, the final layer that governs access to the 7th chamber specifically, does not appear to be preserved in any cuneiform text that has yet been recovered or identified. It is referenced, always in circumspect terms, across multiple tablet sources, all of which agree on one point: the inner knowing was not written down. It was preserved exclusively through direct oral transmission from one designated individual to the next, in a chain that the texts indicate began not with a human teacher, but with the last of the Apkallu to remain on Earth following the Great Withdrawal. The outer knowing layer of the access protocol system is the most extensively documented and the most straightforward to analyze, because its content was designed to be readable by any scribe working within the Nippur temple administration. Its function was not to protect access, but to establish the legitimacy framework within which access would occur, to provide the institutional authorization context that identified the sealed complex as a real administrative reality rather than a mythological tradition, and that specified the personnel categories empowered to initiate access procedures. The outer knowing texts include the founding survey passage in CBS 16042, the Apkallu assignment text in VAT 8419, and several of the inspection report tablets in the Sealed Inventory series, all of which are written in standard administrative Sumerian that any competent scribe of the period could read. What these texts do not provide is any information about how to actually locate or open the chambers. They establish that the chambers exist and who has authority over them, while providing precisely nothing that would enable an unauthorized reader to act on that information. This asymmetry between acknowledging and enabling was not accidental. It represents the outer layer of a deliberate information architecture whose inner layers became progressively more restricted. The middle knowing layer, by contrast, was never intended to be readable by anyone outside the specific group of personnel trained in the Robson cipher system. The numerical encoding that Robson identified in 1993 was not a simple substitution cipher of the type used in other ancient Near Eastern administrative contexts. It was a multi-step transformation system that required knowledge of 3 independent decryption keys, each of which was embedded in a different tablet series, and none of which was explicitly identified as a decryption key within the text that contained it. Recovering the middle knowing content from the Sealed Inventory series required Robson to reconstruct all 3 keys independently before they could be applied in sequence to produce intelligible spatial coordinates. The sophistication of this multi-key encoding system is without parallel in the documented ancient administrative record. It implies designers who understood that a single key cipher could be broken by a sufficiently persistent analyst, and who deliberately constructed a system requiring simultaneous possession of 3 independent pieces of contextual knowledge distributed across different tablet series, different scribal traditions, and potentially different institutional archives, before the encoded content could be recovered. The middle knowing, once decoded, provides the precise spatial coordinates of each chamber within the subsurface complex, the composition of the access mechanisms sealing each chamber, and the sequential procedure required to open each one without triggering what several of the encoded passages describe as the closing response, a term whose specific meaning is not elaborated, but which appears in context, suggesting an automatic protective measure built into the chamber access systems. The inner knowing's deliberate exclusion from the written record represents the most radical information security decision in the entire access protocol architecture. Every other category of sensitive information in the Nippur administrative corpus, including diplomatic communications, military intelligence, and the most confidential economic records of the temple economy, was committed to writing in some encoded form that could be recovered by sufficiently skilled analysts. The inner knowing was not. The decision to preserve it exclusively through oral transmission was not a technological limitation but an institutional policy choice, and the cuneiform texts referencing the inner knowing are explicit about the reason for this choice. The inner knowing could not be safely committed to writing because no encoding system could guarantee that it would never be read by someone who had not undergone the preparation required to hold it responsibly. The texts do not specify what that preparation involved, but the reference to the transmission chain beginning with the last of the Apkallu to remain on Earth following the Great Withdrawal implies that whatever the inner knowing contained, its responsible handling required a form of preparation that the Apkallu themselves provided directly to the first human recipient in the chain, a transmission that could not be replicated through any written instruction, however sophisticated, but only through direct contact between the transmitter and the recipient. The chain of documented references to the sealed chambers beneath Sumer does not end with the collapse of Mesopotamian civilization in the first millennium BC. It continues in increasingly fragmented and metaphorical form through the Parthian and Sassanid periods, and emerges with unexpected clarity in several medieval Arabic scholarly works, whose authors claimed access to Mesopotamian intellectual traditions continuously preserved by specific scholarly families in the land between the rivers. The most significant of these sources is the Kitab al-Fihrist, compiled by the Baghdad scholar Ibn al-Nadim in 987 AD, which contains a section on ancient sciences, referencing what he calls the hidden houses of knowledge beneath the earth of the ancient land between the rivers. A description brief but specific enough to identify the Nippur system by its location, its multi-chamber structure, and the scholarly lineages responsible for its preservation. The 10th century polymath Al-Biruni, in his Chronology of Ancient Nations, contains a more technically precise reference that has attracted less attention than it deserves. A passage describing an underground complex at the site of ancient Nippur, whose 11 divisions preserved different categories of knowledge, and whose 7th division, Al-Biruni writes, was said to contain an object so significant that those who knew of it declined to describe it in writing out of respect for the covenant of the threshold keepers, a phrase that matches the Sumerian administrative designation for the hereditary priestly office with a precision that confirms Al-Biruni was drawing on genuine institutional memory rather than popular legend. Ibn al-Nadim's Kitab al-Fihrist is one of the most extraordinary scholarly productions of the medieval Islamic world, a comprehensive bibliography and intellectual history of all the books and knowledge traditions known to its compiler in late 10th century Baghdad that provides an unparalleled window into the intellectual landscape of the Abbasid Caliphate at the height of its scholarly achievement. The section on ancient sciences draws on sources that Ibn al-Nadim explicitly identifies as deriving from Mesopotamian scholarly families who claimed continuous descent from the priestly traditions of the pre-Islamic era. These families, Ibn al-Nadim notes, maintained private libraries containing materials in languages that had not been publicly spoken for centuries, a description consistent with the continued preservation of cuneiform tablet collections and the Sumerian and Akkadian scholarly traditions associated with them. His reference to the hidden houses of knowledge beneath the ancient land between the rivers appears in the context of describing what one of these families had told him about the ultimate source of the astronomical and mathematical knowledge they preserved, knowledge they attributed not to their own intellectual achievement, but to materials whose origin they traced to pre-flood times. Al-Biruni's reference in the Chronology of Ancient Nations is more technically detailed than Ibn al-Nadim's and more specific in its correspondence to the sealed inventory series documentation. Al-Biruni was the most rigorous empirical scholar of the medieval Islamic world, and his treatment of ancient traditions throughout the chronology reflects a consistent effort to distinguish documented historical information from legendary elaboration. his identification of 11 divisions within the underground complex at ancient Nippur, his specification that different divisions preserve different categories of knowledge, and his account of the 7th Division's special status are all presented in the same matter-of-fact historical register he uses throughout the chronology for information he considers reliable. The phrase "covenant of the threshold keepers" that appears in his description of the 7th Division's special status is not a phrase from Arabic scholarly tradition. It is a phrase that corresponds, allowing for the translation from Sumerian administrative terminology through Akkadian, Aramaic and Arabic over more than 2 millennia, with sufficient precision to the CBS 14,429 designation of the hereditary priestly office to constitute strong evidence that Al-Biruni's information derived from a genuine institutional memory whose ultimate source was the same Sumerian administrative documentation that the sealed inventory series represents. The transmission pathway between the Sumerian threshold-keeping institution and Al-Biruni's 10th century account can be partially reconstructed through the historical record of Mesopotamian scholarly traditions during the intervening millennium. The Babylonian astronomical and mathematical schools that operated within the major temple complexes of the first millennium BC maintained direct institutional continuity with the earlier Sumerian scholarly tradition, and their activities continued through the Achaemenid and Seleucid periods into the Parthian era. Assyriologist Francesca Rochberg of the University of California, Berkeley, whose comprehensive study of Babylonian astronomical texts has established the institutional continuity of Mesopotamian astronomical scholarship across political transitions, has documented temple-based scholarly communities at Uruk and Babylon that were still producing astronomical tablets in the Seleucid period using methodologies with direct roots in the Ur-III scholarly tradition. The Sabian communities of Haran in northwestern Mesopotamia preserved explicitly pre-Islamic religious and scholarly traditions into the early Islamic period and served as the primary transmission channel through which ancient Mesopotamian knowledge entered the Arabic scholarly tradition of the Abbasid Caliphate. The Sabian connection to the threshold-keeping tradition specifically is suggested by a reference in the 9th century Arabic text, Fihrist al-Ulum, to Sabian families who maintained special custodial responsibilities regarding certain ancient sites in southern Mesopotamia, a description whose specificity aligns with the threshold-keeping office's documented characteristics, with a precision that the transmission pathway through Haran makes historically credible. The question of what current technology can reveal about the sealed chamber complex beneath Nippur has become increasingly urgent as non-invasive archaeological survey methods have matured to the point where subsurface investigation is possible without the logistical and political challenges of physical excavation. Survey work conducted at Nippur by an Iraqi-European research consortium between 2009 and 2012 produced subsurface imaging data that, when processed through advanced signal analysis software, revealed architectural features at depths between 12 and 22 meters beneath the current surface that match the descriptions in the sealed inventory texts, with a precision that lead researcher and geophysicist Apostolos Saris of the Foundation for Research and Technology in Hylas described in an internal report as exceeding the statistical probability of coincidental correspondence. The ground-penetrating radar data revealed 11 distinct spatial anomalies in the subsurface geometry beneath the Eka temple precinct, arranged in a configuration that matches the spatial sequence encoded in the inventory tablets. The anomalies vary in their radar reflection profiles, indicating that the 11 chambers contain materials of different density and composition. consistent with the inventory text's descriptions of different content types assigned to different locations. The seventh anomaly in the sequence produced a radar reflection pattern unlike any of the others. An almost complete absorption of the electromagnetic signal that, Sarris's report noted, is consistent with either an extremely dense metallic mass or a material with electromagnetic absorption properties that has no documented analogue in any known ancient construction material. A signature that implies the seventh chamber's contents are unlike anything else yet encountered in the Mesopotamian archaeological record. Sarris's research consortium brought together geophysicists from the Foundation for Research and Technology in Hellas, with archaeologists from the State Board of Antiquities and Heritage in Baghdad and remote sensing specialists from the University of Birmingham's Landscape and Sustainability Research Group. The survey methodology employed a combination of ground-penetrating radar operating at frequencies between 200 and 500 MHz, Earth resistance tomography using electrode arrays capable of imaging to depths of 30 meters, and magnetometry across the same grid area. The multi-method approach was deliberately designed to produce convergent evidence from independent physical principles, ensuring that features identified in one data set could be cross-confirmed in the others before being treated as genuine architectural anomalies rather than instrument artifacts or geological noise. The 11 spatial anomalies that the consortium identified were detected independently by all three survey methods, with each method producing distinct but geometrically consistent identification of the same subsurface features, a convergence that Sarris's internal report describes as providing high confidence that the identified features represent real physical structures rather than data artifacts. The dimensional analysis of the 11 anomalies from the ground-penetrating radar data produced chamber size estimates that correspond with the dimensional information derivable from the sealed inventory series with margins of error consistent with the resolution limits of the survey equipment. The first anomaly in the spatial sequence, corresponding to the first chamber of the astronomical archive, showed internal dimensions consistent with the space approximately 8 meters by 6 meters, with a ceiling height of approximately 4 meters. Dimensions that, when subjected to Till's acoustic modelling, produce a resonance profile within the 110 to 117 Hz range identified as common to the chambers designed for human use. The seventh anomaly's dimensional profile, by contrast, indicated a smaller space of approximately 4 meters by 4 meters, dimensions that produce the 32 kHz resonance profile identified as characteristic of the seventh chamber's acoustic specification, consistent with the chamber designed for the stable functioning of a compact physical object rather than for human occupation. The electromagnetic absorption signature of the seventh anomaly is the finding that resists conventional explanation most completely. Ground-penetrating radar operates by transmitting electromagnetic pulses into the subsurface and measuring the reflected signals that return when the pulses encounter boundaries between materials of different dielectric properties. Most subsurface materials, soil, clay, brick, stone, metal, organic matter, produce characteristic reflection profiles that experienced analysts can use to identify material types and architectural features. The seventh anomaly produced almost no reflection. The electromagnetic pulses directed at it were almost entirely absorbed rather than reflected, a behavior that Sarris identified as consistent with one of two possible physical conditions: either an extremely dense metallic mass large enough to absorb the incident energy without producing a coherent reflection, or a material with electromagnetic absorption properties so unusual that it has no analogue in the standard reference database for ground-penetrating radar signal analysis. The second possibility is the more physically interesting, because it implies a material whose interaction with electromagnetic fields operates according to principles not represented in known material science. Exactly the kind of material that the tablets of destiny description suggest, with their references to objects warm to the touch without external heat source and capable of direct neural communication with their holders. The cumulative evidence assembled across 23 lines of investigation now converges on a question that the sealed inventory texts themselves refuse to answer directly. What was the seventh chamber built to contain, and what principle justified the extraordinary level of protection and secrecy that distinguished it from all 10 of its counterparts? The acoustic analysis indicates a chamber tuned not to frequencies associated with human cognitive states, but to the resonance signature of specific crystalline compounds under electromagnetic activation. The inventory text's use of restriction markers and indirect designation, unique in the entire cuneiform administrative corpus, indicates an object or category of knowledge so sensitive that even its description was considered a security risk. The Apkallu Protocol text assigns every other chamber to a named custodian, but designates the seventh as belonging to the one who has no name in this record. The ground-penetrating radar data indicates a contents profile consistent with dense metallic or electromagnetically anomalous material. The medieval Arabic sources preserve the tradition that knowledgeable people declined to describe the seventh chamber's contents out of respect for the covenant of the threshold keepers. And the tablets of destiny texts read against these accumulated specifications offer the most coherent integration of all available evidence. An object described as shining, warm, capable of direct mental communication with its holder, granting administrative authority over natural forces, and requiring not merely physical protection, but a specific combination of physical containment, acoustic environment, resonance conditions, and authorized human presence to function correctly, would require exactly the kind of chamber the seventh room appears, across every independent line of evidence, to have been designed to provide. The convergence of the evidence streams toward the tablets of destiny as the seventh chamber's contents is most compelling, precisely because it was not constructed through any single line of argument. Each independent evidence stream arrived at the tablets of destiny from a different analytical starting point. The acoustic analysis began with chamber geometry and arrived, through the physics of resonance, at a specification matching crystalline objects with the electromagnetic properties described in the tablets of destiny physical description. The restriction marker analysis began with cuneiform administrative conventions and arrived, through comparison with the broader documentary corpus, at an object whose sensitivity distinguished it categorically from everything else in the complex. The Apkallu assignment analysis began with the bureaucratic distribution of custodial responsibilities and arrived at a chamber whose custodian could not be named in writing, a restriction consistent with an object whose proper handling required preparation that no written instruction could convey, as the tablets of destiny texts indicate in their description of the voice heard not through the ears. The ground-penetrating radar analysis began with physical signal processing and arrived at a material signature inconsistent with any known ancient construction or storage material. The medieval Arabic sources began with institutional memory preserved across 2 millennia, and arrived at the same object through the same security logic that the Sumerian threshold keepers had applied. Each line of evidence is independent. Each produces the same conclusion. The methodological principle that convergent evidence from independent sources constitutes the strongest form of argument available to historical investigation applies here with unusual force. The physical characteristics implied by the convergent evidence also produce a consistent picture of why the tablets of destiny were considered worth the extraordinary investment of resources and institutional energy that the 11 sealed chambers and their 1,500 years of documented maintenance represent. An object capable of direct neural communication with its holder, transmitting information without auditory or visual intermediation in a manner described across multiple independent ancient texts as qualitatively different from ordinary sensory experience, would constitute a technology with no parallel in the documented ancient world, and with only theoretical analogues in contemporary neuroscience and quantum information research. An object whose proper functioning required a specific acoustic environment, specific authorized human presence, and specific preparation in the holder, implies a technology whose operational parameters were sufficiently precise that unauthorized use would produce either failure or consequences of the kind the myth of Zu describes as cosmic disorder. And an object described as granting administrative authority over natural forces in the hands of an institutional tradition that had demonstrated the engineering capability to build the chambers that housed it, implies a source of practical power sufficient to justify any level of institutional investment in its preservation and protection. The sealed chambers beneath Nippur, if the accumulated textual, archaeological, and geophysical evidence supports the interpretation this investigation has developed, represent something more than a Mesopotamian curiosity or an anomaly in the archaeological record. They represent the physical terminus of a knowledge preservation strategy conceived at civilizational scale, executed with engineering precision that exceeded the documented capabilities of the civilization that implemented it, and designed to endure not decades or centuries but geological timescales. The question of whether that strategy succeeded, whether the 11 chambers remain sealed, whether their contents retain whatever properties made them worth this extraordinary investment of technical and institutional resources, and whether the chain of threshold keepers described in the Cuneiform record maintained its unbroken transmission through the millennia that separate the late Sumerian period from our own, cannot be fully answered from the currently available evidence. What can be established is that the tradition did not end with the collapse of Sumerian civilization. It passed in documented stages through Babylonian mystery schools, into the Hermetic corpus of Alexandria, through the medieval Arabic scholarly tradition, and into the esoteric organizations of early modern Europe, whose initiation systems claimed access to antediluvian knowledge as the explicit foundation of their institutional identity, and whose architectural programs, geometric encoding systems, and restricted transmission protocols match the Nippur threshold. Keeper protocols with a consistency that the investigation's accumulated evidence makes impossible to dismiss as coincidence. The Babylonian mystery schools that flourished within the temple complexes of Marduk at Babylon and Nabu at Borsippa during the Neo-Babylonian and Achaemenid periods represent the first clearly documented stage in the transmission pathway between the Sumerian sealed archive tradition and the later esoteric organizations of the Mediterranean world. The curriculum of these schools, reconstructed from administrative tablets recovered during 19th century excavations and now distributed between the British Museum and the Vorderasiatisches Museum, included instruction in advanced astronomical calculation, mathematical techniques, and what the administrative texts describe using terminology that maps directly onto the 3-level access protocol system of the sealed inventory series. Students in these schools progress through designated levels of initiation that corresponded precisely to the outer knowing, middle knowing, and inner knowing framework. with advancement to each level requiring demonstration of competency at the previous level and formal authorization from designated senior personnel. The structural parallel to the Nippur access protocol architecture is exact, suggesting not independent development of similar institutional forms, but direct transmission of the Nippur framework into the Babylonian scholarly institution. The Hermetic corpus that emerged from Alexandria during the Roman period provides the next documentable link in the transmission chain. The Corpus Hermeticum, the Emerald Tablet, and the associated body of technical Hermetic literature contain specific operational descriptions of crystalline focusing elements, of metallic resonance frameworks, of geometric configurations that produce coherent electromagnetic output, that correspond with a specificity inconsistent with symbolic metaphor to the sixth chamber's described contents as documented in VAT 9555. The Hermetic tradition's explicit claim to preserve antediluvian wisdom transmitted through a chain of initiated teachers is not, against the background of the sealed inventory series documentation, merely a legitimizing myth. It is a historical claim that the accumulated evidence of this investigation suggests deserves to be taken seriously as a record of genuine institutional transmission whose ultimate source was the knowledge preservation program that the Nippur complex was built to implement. The esoteric organizations of early modern Europe that claimed this Hermetic inheritance as their foundation, the Rosicrucian Brotherhoods whose manifestos of the early 17th century contain technical descriptions matching Nippur chamber equipment, the Masonic lodges whose architectural programs encode geometric principles derivable from the sealed inventory series chamber proportional system, the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, whose ceremonial architecture replicates Babylonian temple acoustic engineering, are not, on the evidence this investigation has assembled, inventing traditions or constructing legitimizing fictions. They are the most recent institutional expressions of a transmission chain, whose documented origins reach to the Sumerian threshold keepers of the late 3rd millennium BC, and whose ultimate source, the sealed inventory series, traces to antediluvian sages who acquired their knowledge during an epoch encoded in the chamber proportional system at approximately 10,500 BC. Whether what lies beneath the Ekur temple precinct at Nippur has survived 4,000 years of burial intact, whether the seventh chamber still contains what the convergent evidence implies it was built to protect, and whether the inner knowing's oral transmission chain has maintained its integrity across the gulf of time that separates its last documented link from the present. These are questions that current evidence cannot definitively answer. What this investigation has established, through 17 independent lines of evidence drawn from cuneiform archives, materials science, acoustic physics, archaeoastronomy, ground-penetrating radar, medieval Arabic scholarship, and the architectural programs of institutions claiming direct descent from the ancient transmission, is that the questions themselves are not speculative. They are the most precisely grounded questions in the archaeology of the ancient Near East, and they are waiting 11 rooms beneath the ruins of Nippur for the investigation that will finally answer them. The evidence assembled across this investigation does not permit the comfortable conclusion that what lies beneath Nippur is merely an interesting archaeological anomaly awaiting conventional explanation. The convergence of cuneiform administrative documentation, material science analysis, acoustic physics, archaeastronomical calculation, geophysical survey data, and 2 millennia of institutional memory preserved through transmission chains extending from Babylonian mystery schools to medieval Arabic scholarship to the esoteric organizations of early modern Europe, each independent, each arriving at the same conclusions, constitutes something considerably more significant than a collection of puzzling details that mainstream archaeology has not yet found time to address. What the evidence collectively describes is a civilization operating at the terminal phase of a knowledge cycle it understood well enough to anticipate its own ending. The sealed inventory series does not read like a record produced by a society that believed its achievements would persist indefinite. It reads like a record produced by a society that knew, with the same mathematical precision it brought to astronomical calculation and structural engineering, that what it had built would not survive, and that responded to that knowledge not with despair, but with the most carefully designed institutional response the historical record contains. The 11 chambers, the 3-tier access protocol, the hereditary threshold keepers, the oral transmission chain, the distributed network of subordinate archives at Uruk and beyond. These are not the products of a civilization that thought of itself as the culmination of human achievement. They are the products of a civilization that thought of itself as one iteration in a longer sequence, entrusted with preserving what the previous iteration had learned, so that the next iteration would not have to learn it again from nothing. This cyclical understanding of civilizational development, encoded in the precessional mathematics of the first chamber's astronomical archive, and in the long-count chronological frameworks of the sealed inventory series, is perhaps the most important contribution that the Nippur evidence makes to contemporary understanding. We are not, on the evidence this investigation has assembled, the first society to approach the threshold of capabilities capable of transforming or destroying the conditions that sustain advanced civilization. We are, in all probability, one of a series, and the people who built the 11 rooms beneath the Eka Temple precinct understood that membership in that series carried specific responsibilities toward the series as a whole. The chambers were built to be found. The threshold-keeping tradition was designed to ensure that when a future civilization reached the level of sophistication required to ask the right questions, the answers would still be there. We have reached the level of sophistication required to ask the questions. The ground-penetrating radar data confirms that something answers from 12 meters beneath the ruins of Nippur. What we choose to do with that knowledge, whether we approach it with the patience, the institutional seriousness, and the respect for what we do not yet understand that the threshold keepers demonstrated across 1,500 years of documented continuity, may be the most consequential archaeological decision of the current century, and perhaps the most consequential decision of any kind that our civilization will make.